The Assyrian story begins not in the splendour of great capitals or the thunder of conquering armies, but in the land itself, the geographic stage upon which human settlement would gradually shape a culture of endurance and ambition. Northern Mesopotamia, the broad zone stretching between the middle Tigris and the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, offered conditions unlike those of the southern plain that nurtured Sumer and later Babylon. Here, the land rose gently toward rolling hills and uplands, while the Tigris flowed more swiftly than the sluggish Euphrates far to the west. The climate was harsher, with colder winters that dusted the hills with snow, shorter summers broken by dry winds, and rainfall that, while modest, was enough to allow agriculture without the elaborate irrigation systems that southern city-states depended upon. This environment, demanding but not unforgiving, produced communities that were resilient, self-reliant, and positioned astride routes linking Anatolia, the Levant, Iran, and the southern alluvium. Geography placed Assyria at the crossroads of civilizations, and that reality shaped the way its people would define themselves for centuries. Archaeological discoveries show that human presence in this region reaches deep into prehistory. By the 7th millennium BCE, farming villages dotted the landscape, cultivating wheat and barley while tending sheep and goats. This site of Nineveh, which would later become the capital of an empire, already shows evidence of occupation during this period. Pottery traditions, architectural remains, and traces of early shrines reveal a culture that was integrated into wider networks of exchange. Obsidian from Anatolia, copper from the Iranian plateau, and exotic shells from the Persian Gulf all appear in northern Mesopotamian sites, demonstrating that long before the Assyrians emerged as a political entity, the land itself was already bound to the currents of regional trade. Settlement here was never isolated. It was part of a continuum that linked multiple worlds. The rivers were central to this landscape, and among them, the Tigris dominated. Unlike the Euphrates with its broad floodplains and meandering course, the Tigris cut more directly, with narrower valleys and stronger currents. For the communities along its banks, this meant both opportunity and challenge. The river provided a natural artery for transport, carrying goods and people over long distances, but it also posed risks with unpredictable flooding. The Assyrians would learn to harness this river, building canals, controlling flows, and integrating its waters into agricultural systems that supported growing populations. Yet the Tigris also gave them an advantage. It connected their heartland northward to Anatolia and southward to Babylon, making their cities hubs in a network of long-distance interaction. Geography made Assyria a corridor, and corridors are rarely quiet. They are contested, coveted, and constantly exposed to outside influence. It is within this setting that the first urban centres took form. By the 3rd millennium BCE, settlements such as Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela were already important nodes. Ashur in particular emerged as the defining nucleus. Situated on a promontory overlooking the Tigris, the city combined strategic defensibility with direct access to trade routes moving west into Syria and east into the Zagros. Its early temples, dedicated to the city god Ashur, demonstrate the fusion of religion and civic identity that would characterize Assyrian history. Ashur the god was at first not a cosmic creator in the sense of Enlil or Anu, but a divine personification of the city itself. To serve Ashur was to serve the community, and as the community grew, so did its god. This direct relationship between place and deity made Assyrian religion unusually bound to political geography. From the perspective of southern Mesopotamian scribes, the north was always a land of both promise and tension. Administrative texts from the Akkadian and Ur-Thur dynasties refer to northern settlements, sometimes as trade outposts, sometimes as rebellious territories. The north offered valuable resources: timber from the mountains, metals from Anatolia, horses from the uplands, but it was also harder to control than the alluvial plain. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon and Naram-Sin extended its reach into Assyrian territory, incorporating Ashur into its dominion. Archaeological levels at Ashur and Nineveh show Akkadian influence in administrative practices, art, and temple construction. Yet the north retained distinctiveness. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed around 2200 BCE, under the weight of internal revolts and external invasions, Assyria was not erased. Instead, its cities endured, adapting to new political realities and preserving traditions that would later serve as the foundation for their resurgence. The continuity of occupation at Ashur is striking. Excavations reveal that while political authority shifted across centuries, the city maintained its sacred precincts, rebuilt its temples, and kept alive the cult of its patron deity. This long persistence created a sense of rootedness, a cultural memory that would prove essential when later kings sought to legitimize expansion by invoking the antiquity of their institutions. Assyrian rulers did not claim to be inventing kingship. They claimed to be restoring or continuing what had always been present in the city of Ashur. Such appeals to continuity were more than rhetoric. They reflected the lived reality of a community that had survived waves of external control yet retained its identity. The environment itself further reinforced resilience. Unlike southern Mesopotamia, where irrigation agriculture required centralized organization to build and maintain canals, the rainfall-based farming of the north allowed smaller communities more autonomy. This relative independence may explain why Assyria was less vulnerable to total collapse during times of imperial decline in the south. When Ur fell, southern cities suffered catastrophic depopulation, but the Assyrian heartland persisted. This persistence created opportunities for local elites to expand their influence once the shadow of southern hegemony faded. Trade was the lifeblood of early Assyria, and the geography of northern Mesopotamia positioned its merchants at the centre of a vast network. During the early 2nd millennium BCE, Assyrian traders established colonies deep in Anatolia, most famously at Kanesh, modern Kultepe in Turkey. Thousands of clay tablets discovered there record the daily operations of these merchants, contracts, debts, marriage arrangements, and lawsuits. The texts reveal a sophisticated commercial system, with caravans carrying tin and textiles from Assyria into Anatolia and returning with silver and other goods. These records also preserve the names of families across generations, showing how commerce created enduring social ties between Ashur and distant cities. The merchants operated with relative independence, but always under the watchful authority of their city's institutions. Ashur was both metropolis and marketplace, and through its trade networks, it projected influence far beyond its immediate territory. The geography that enabled these connections also exposed Assyria to constant pressure from neighbours. To the west lay the lands of the Amorites and later the Hittites. To the east, the highland groups of the Zagros posed both opportunities for trade and threats of raids. To the south, Babylon grew into a major power under Hammurabi, whose campaigns extended into Assyrian territory. Syria's position meant it could never remain entirely isolated. Its survival depended on adaptation, sometimes yielding to stronger powers, sometimes asserting independence when conditions allowed. This balance between subordination and autonomy is a recurring theme in Assyrian history, and its roots lie in the geography of the land between worlds. The god Ashur's rise as the central symbol of Assyrian identity cannot be separated from this landscape. In a region where every city had its patron deity, the Assyrians transformed theirs into the embodiment of political destiny. As Assyrian rulers extended their authority, they declared their actions to be undertaken on behalf of Ashur, not only defending his city but expanding his dominion. Conquest was not framed as mere acquisition of land, it was service to the god. This theological political framework grew directly from the intimate connection between the city, its deity, and the land. Unlike other Mesopotamian pantheons where gods governed multiple aspects of cosmic order, the Assyrian supreme deity was the very personification of their homeland and its aspirations. Geography also influenced architecture. The early temples at Ashur and later at Nineveh and Nimrud reveal orientation toward the river, integration with defensive structures, and adaptation to the uneven terrain. Unlike the massive ziggurats of the south, which rose from flat plains as artificial mountains, Assyrian religious complexes often incorporated natural elevations. This blending of architecture with landscape reflected a different conception of sacred space, less about imposing order upon a chaotic floodplain, more about harmonizing human construction with the contours of hills and riverbanks. These early architectural choices foreshadowed the monumental building projects of later kings, who would transform entire landscapes into expressions of power. As we move deeper into the second millennium, the Assyrian cities would transition from merchant hubs and local centres of power into the heart of a kingdom. But this transformation can only be understood by appreciating the foundation laid by the land itself. The Assyrians were a product of their geography, the swift Tigris, the rolling hills, the intersection of routes that linked continents, their endurance in the face of stronger southern states, their mercantile acumen, their ability to recover from periods of eclipse. All of these traits reflect the conditions of the northern Mesopotamian environment. The land shaped the people, and the people in turn would eventually reshape the land through conquest, administration, and monumental construction. What began as a cluster of settlements along a river became, through centuries of adaptation, a culture uniquely prepared to seize moments of opportunity. And when those moments came, Assyrian kings would transform geography into destiny, building one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world. But before the imperial age, before the great armies and the monumental capitals, there was simply the land, the rivers, and the first cities whose endurance provided the foundation upon which all else would be built. The emergence of the first cities in Assyria marks the transition from scattered settlements to organised centres of power, religion and trade. Among them, Ashur and Nineveh stand as the most enduring names, not only because they became symbols of Assyrian identity, but also because their origins reveal how northern Mesopotamian communities adapted the southern model of urbanism to their own geography and needs. In the 3rd millennium BCE, as the cities of Sumer and Akkad flourished in the south, the northern landscape saw the steady growth of its own urban centres. These were not copies of their southern counterparts, though they shared many features such as temples, administrative buildings and walled enclosures. Instead, they reflected local conditions, blending the traditions of Mesopotamian city life with the unique opportunities and challenges of the northern Tigris region. Ashur was the nucleus. Perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Tigris, it commanded a position of both defensibility and accessibility. The city's location allowed control over river traffic, while also connecting it to caravan routes that stretched westward into Syria and eastward across the Zagros. This dual orientation, riverine and overland, made Ashur a hub of exchange from its earliest days. Archaeological excavations reveal layers of occupation dating back to the 3rd millennium, with evidence of temples, residential quarters, and defensive walls. The earliest monumental structure identified in Ashur was a temple dedicated to the city god, who would take the name Ashur. Unlike deities with long mythological pedigrees, Ashur was at first the embodiment of the city itself. The close identification of city and god meant that as Ashur prospered, so too did the divine authority associated with it. The role of Ashur as both city and deity highlights a distinctive feature of Assyrian identity. In southern Mesopotamia, gods were cosmic figures whose cults extended across multiple cities, such as Enlil in Nippur or Inanna in Uruk. In the north, however, Ashur was inseparable from his city. To leave Ashur, the city was, in a sense, to leave the god's presence. When Assyrian kings later expanded their domains, they carried with them the ideology that conquest was performed on behalf of Ashur, effectively exporting the authority of their home city. This integration of urban centre and divine power provided a strong foundation for political expansion, but in its earliest form it was simply the natural outcome of a community that tied its sacred and civic life together. Nineveh, located further upstream along the Tigris, was another ancient settlement whose origins predate Assyria's rise as a kingdom. Excavations at Nineveh reveal continuous occupation from the Neolithic period onward, with evidence of temples dedicated to the goddess Ishtar by the 3rd millennium BCE. Unlike Ashur, which was initially defined by its association with its namesake god, Nineveh's early identity was tied to a more widely recognized Mesopotamian deity. Ishtar of Nineveh, a manifestation of the great goddess of love and war, became a powerful figure in local worship. This gave Nineveh a distinct religious orientation, linking it to broader Mesopotamian traditions, while also granting it prestige as a center of Ishtar's cult. Over time, Nineveh's association with the goddess would attract royal attention, and later Assyrian kings would pour immense resources into expanding her temples. Yet even in these earlier stages, the city's religious significance made it a natural magnet for settlement, trade, and political authority. The archaeological record at Nineveh also reveals how the city grew as a node in regional exchange. Pottery styles show influences from both the southern Mesopotamian alluvium and from Anatolia, reflecting its position as an intermediary zone. Burial practices, building techniques, and artistic motifs similarly demonstrate a blending of traditions, suggesting that Nineveh was a place where cultures met and mingled. This cosmopolitan character would persist throughout its history, and by the 1st millennium BCE it would become a metropolis famous for its size and wealth. But in the 3rd and 2nd millennia, its importance lay in its early role as a city where religious, economic and political currents intersected. Urban foundations in Assyria were not limited to Ashur and Nineveh. Arbela, later known for its Temple of Ishtar and its association with royal oracles, also emerged during this period as a settlement of regional importance. Smaller sites such as Katara and Akalatum appear in textual and archaeological sources, indicating that the Assyrian landscape was dotted with cities of varying scale and influence. Together, they formed a network of urban centres that balanced cooperation and competition, linked by trade routes, but also separated by local loyalties. These early cities were not yet part of a unified kingdom, but they shared enough cultural traits to lay the groundwork for what would later become a coherent Assyrian state. The structure of these early cities followed familiar Mesopotamian patterns, but with adaptations to local geography. Defensive walls enclosed the main settlements, often following the contours of natural ridges or riverbanks. Inside, temples stood at the heart of the community, serving not only as places of worship, but also as centres of administration and storage. Clay tablets found at Ashur and other sites reveal that temple authorities controlled grain, livestock and trade goods, acting as both religious and economic managers. The palace, when present, occupied another central position, though in the earlier stages the distinction between temple and palace authority was less clear than it would later become. Residential quarters spread outward from these central institutions, with narrow streets and tightly packed houses reflecting the density of urban life. These cities developed in dialogue with the larger world. Ashur and Nineveh were not isolated outposts. They were part of the Mesopotamian cultural continuum. Cylinder seals, inscriptions, and art from the 3rd millennium show shared motifs with southern Mesopotamia. Administrative practices, including the use of cuneiform writing on clay tablets, were adopted and adapted by northern scribes. This cultural borrowing underscores the importance of connections across the Mesopotamian world. Yet at the same time, the Assyrian cities developed distinct characteristics, particularly in their emphasis on the direct relationship between city deity and political authority. The old Assyrian trading colonies of the early 2nd millennium BCE reveal how deeply embedded these cities were in long-distance networks. Merchants from Ashur established outposts in Anatolia, most famously at Kanesh, where thousands of tablets provide detailed accounts of commercial life. These records describe how caravans transported tin and textiles northward, while returning with silver and other goods. They also document family relationships, legal disputes, and religious practices, providing a vivid picture of Assyrian society at this early stage. What emerges is an image of a people who were organised, pragmatic, and deeply tied to their urban institutions. Even abroad, Assyrian merchants remained connected to their home city, sending profits back, maintaining religious observances, and acknowledging the authority of Ashur. The city was not only a physical location, but also a social and cultural anchor. The rise of these early cities must also be understood in the context of shifting political landscapes. During the 3rd millennium BCE, the Akkadian Empire extended its control over northern Mesopotamia, incorporating Ashur into its administrative system. Later, the 3rd dynasty of Ur attempted similar domination. These periods of foreign rule influenced the development of Assyrian cities, introducing administrative practices, architectural styles, and cultural traditions that would be absorbed into local contexts. Yet each time an empire collapsed, the cities of Assyria reasserted themselves, demonstrating resilience and continuity. This pattern of subordination, followed by revival, became a defining feature of Assyrian history, rooted in the durability of its earliest urban foundations. Ashur and Nineveh, though distinct in their origins, together provided the pillars upon which later Assyrian power would rest. Ashur symbolized the unity of city, god, and state, while Nineveh embodied religious prestige and cultural cosmopolitanism. Their coexistence within the Assyrian landscape created a dual identity that combined pragmatic political authority with spiritual grandeur. Later kings would exploit this duality, building capitals at Ashur, Nineveh, and eventually Nimrud and Dursharukin, each contributing to the projection of power. But the seeds of that trajectory were planted in the 3rd and 2nd millennia, when these cities first emerged as centres of life along the Tigris. The urban foundations of Assyria also shaped the social fabric of its people. Life in Ashur and Nineveh revolved around the cycles of agriculture, trade, and religious festivals. Farmers cultivated the surrounding lands, bringing produce into the city for redistribution. Merchants organised caravans, contracting with families and financiers to share risks and profits. Priests conducted rituals in the temples, ensuring divine favour for both community and economy. Artisans produced goods in workshops, ranging from pottery to textiles to metalwork. The interdependence of these roles created a complex society, one in which every class contributed to the survival and prosperity of the city. This social cohesion, rooted in the earliest phases of Assyrian urbanism, would later enable the state to mobilise vast resources for empire. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the outlines of a distinct Assyrian identity were becoming visible. The cities of Ashur and Nineveh had established themselves as enduring centres, their temples enshrined deities who linked divine authority with civic life. Their merchants had extended influence across Anatolia, and their resilience in the face of foreign domination demonstrated a capacity for endurance. The foundations were in place for the political transformations that would soon follow, as local kings consolidated power and began to project Assyrian authority beyond the city walls. What began as communities clustered along the Tigris was evolving into a kingdom whose destiny was tied to the strength and continuity of its urban heart. The development of kingship in Assyria did not occur overnight, nor did it emerge fully formed as the absolute monarchy of later centuries. In its earliest phases, authority in Assyrian cities such as Ashur and Nineveh rested not in a single figure but in assemblies of elders, priests, and leading families. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that these councils managed communal affairs, regulated trade, and oversaw religious rituals. This system reflected both the practical realities of early urban life and the traditions of Mesopotamian governance, where collective bodies often played key roles in decision-making. Yet the pressures of defence, diplomacy, and expanding trade gradually elevated individuals above the collective, and out of this evolution, the institution of kingship emerged. At Ashur, the earliest rulers referred to themselves not as kings, but as governors or stewards of the god Ashur. The term they used, Ensi, emphasized their role as caretakers rather than sovereigns. This distinction is significant, for it reveals that political authority was initially understood as service to the deity and the community rather than personal power. The ruler was the representative of Ashur, entrusted with maintaining order, organizing rituals and ensuring prosperity. In this framework, the assembly of elders still held substantial influence, acting as advisors and participants in civic decisions. The balance between communal authority and individual leadership defined the earlier stage of Assyrian political development. Over time, however, external pressures required stronger central authority. Trade networks reaching into Anatolia demanded reliable contracts, enforcement mechanisms, and protection for caravans. Raids from highland tribes and rival city-states necessitated organized military responses. Negotiations with powerful southern states such as Babylon and required unified representation. In these circumstances, the role of the governor expanded, and the path toward kingship became clearer. The individual who could lead armies, negotiate treaties, and command resources gained stature, and the title of ruler began to carry more weight. The transition is visible in the titulary of early Assyrian leaders. While the earliest names preserved in king lists and inscriptions emphasize stewardship, later rulers adopted the Akkadian term sharu, meaning king. This change did not merely reflect linguistic borrowing, but a profound transformation in political ideology. By calling themselves kings, Assyrian rulers aligned themselves with the broader Mesopotamian tradition of monarchic authority, which was already well established in Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Yet the Assyrian version retained a distinctive feature. The king remained closely bound to the god Ashur. His legitimacy did not rest solely on personal achievement or dynastic lineage, but on his role as earthly representative of the city's deity. The divine dimension of kingship was critical. In Mesopotamian thought, political authority was inseparable from the gods. The famous Sumerian king list declared that kingship itself descended from heaven. In Assyria, this principle took an especially literal form. Since Ashur was both city and god, the ruler who governed Ashur did so as the chosen servant of the deity. Every decision, every campaign, and every construction project could be framed as service to Ashur. This framework ensured that the king's authority was not arbitrary, but divinely sanctioned, while also binding the community to his leadership through shared religious identity. Archaeological remains from Ashur illustrate how this divine kingship was manifested. Temples dedicated to Ashur were rebuilt and expanded by successive rulers, with each king inscribing his name and deeds on foundation tablets. These inscriptions emphasize not only the physical act of building, but also the pious devotion of the ruler. The temple thus became both a religious center and a monument to royal legitimacy. In parallel, palaces began to emerge as distinct structures, symbolizing the growing separation between king and community. While early rulers may have lived in modest dwellings near the temple, later kings constructed elaborate residences that reflected their elevated status. The spatial organization of the city mirrored the political transformation from collective governance to centralized monarchy. The old Assyrian trading colonies provide further evidence of this shift. The merchants who operated in Anatolia frequently refer to the authority of Ashur's ruler in their contracts and correspondence. While they maintained considerable autonomy, their allegiance to the king was clear. Taxes and fees were paid to the state, and disputes could be appealed to royal courts. This demonstrates that by the early 2nd millennium BCE, the king of Ashur was not merely a local figure, but the recognized head of a polity whose influence extended far beyond the city's walls. The ability to project authority across such distances required both administrative sophistication and personal legitimacy, qualities embodied in the institution of kingship. The ideology of divine kingship also shaped Assyrian law. Fragments of early legal codes from the Middle Assyrian period reveal that the king was considered the source of justice, empowered by Ashur to maintain order. Punishments were severe, reflecting both the harsh realities of frontier life and the theological conviction that disobedience to royal authority was equivalent to disobedience to the god. The king's role as judge reinforced his position as the linchpin of society, responsible not only for military defence and economic management, but also for moral order. This concentration of functions in the person of the king marked the completion of the transition from collective governance to monarchy. It is important to recognise, however, that the rise of kingship did not eliminate the role of assemblies and councils. Inscriptions and later accounts suggest that city elders continued to participate in decision-making, especially in matters of diplomacy and ritual. The king could not govern alone, and his authority rested on the support of leading families and priestly officials. This shared governance created a balance of power that helped stabilise the early kingdom. Yet over time, as royal authority grew more absolute, the influence of these bodies diminished. By the Neo-Assyrian period, the king's word had become law, and assemblies played little more than ceremonial roles. But in the dawn of Assyrian kingship, the echoes of communal governance were still strong. The memory of this evolution was preserved in Assyrian historical traditions. King lists compiled in later periods traced the line of rulers back to the earliest governors, emphasizing continuity across centuries. These lists serve not only as records but as legitimizing documents, demonstrating that kingship in Assyria was an ancient and divinely sanctioned institution. Even when dynasties changed or usurpers seized power, the invocation of Ashur's will provided the necessary justification. In this way, the ideological framework established in the earliest days of kingship continued to shape Assyrian politics throughout its history. The transformation from city elders to divine kingship also reflected broader patterns in Mesopotamian history. Across the region, the challenges of managing growing populations, defending territories, and sustaining trade networks pushed communities towards centralized authority. Yet each region adapted this process to its own conditions. In Assyria, the harsh environment, strategic geography, and close identification of city and god produced a version of kingship that was particularly durable. While other polities rose and fell, Assyria's institution of divine monarchy endured for more than a millennium, providing the framework for one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. The dawn of Assyrian kingship, then, was not a sudden break but a gradual evolution. From councils of elders to governors of the god Ashur, from caretakers to kings, authority slowly concentrated in the hands of individuals who could embody both the community's needs and the god's will. The earliest kings of Assyria did not yet command vast armies or rule over sprawling territories, but they laid the foundations for what was to come. Their titles, rituals, and buildings inscribed the principle that Assyria was not merely a collection of settlements but a polity united under divine kingship. This principle would endure, shaping every stage of Assyrian history from its first rulers to its last emperors. The emergence of Sargon of Akkad in the 24th century BCE was a turning point not only for southern Mesopotamia, but for the entire Fertile Crescent. His rise created the first true territorial empire in recorded history, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and deep into the mountains of Anatolia and Iran. For the northern lands that would become Assyria, Sargon's reign represented both subjugation and instruction. The Akkadian kings brought Ashur and its neighbours under imperial rule, introducing them to new forms of political control and administration, and in the process leaving behind patterns that Assyrian rulers would later imitate, adapt, and surpass. To understand the shadow of Akkad over Assyria is to see how imperial domination became the crucible in which Assyrian kingship and ideology were tempered. Sargon himself emerged from obscurity, a figure whose origins were later wrapped in legend. According to Mesopotamian tradition, he was born of humble parentage, found in a basket on a river, and raised by a gardener before seizing power through his own ambition. Whether or not these stories reflect historical truth, they point to the revolutionary character of his reign. Breaking free from the dynastic traditions of Sumerian city-states, Sargon established a new model of kingship, one that claimed dominion not just over a city or region, but over all the lands. His armies extended Akkadian authority across Mesopotamia, and in doing so they marched into the northern Tigris region, where Assyrian cities lay. The conquest of the north was strategic. Control of Assyria meant control of vital trade routes linking the Mesopotamian core with Anatolia. The merchants of Ashur had already established networks that reached deep into Anatolia, securing tin, copper and silver. By bringing Ashur under Akkadian control, Sargon tapped into this commercial lifeline, ensuring that resources flowed southward to support his growing empire. Archaeological evidence confirms Akkadian presence in Ashur, Nineveh, and other northern cities, with inscriptions and administrative records indicating the presence of imperial officials. For the people of these cities, Akkadian rule meant integration into a larger political and economic system, with all the benefits and burdens that entailed. The imposition of Akkadian administration reshaped Assyrian political life. Governors appointed by Sargon and his successors oversaw the northern cities, ensuring loyalty and extracting tribute. The old assemblies and local councils were subordinated to imperial authority, though they likely continued to function in limited ways. The cult of Ashur was maintained, but its prominence was overshadowed by the worship of Akkadian deities, particularly Ishtar and Enlil. This subordination was not absolute. Local traditions endured, but it forced Assyrian elites to adapt, learning to navigate the demands of imperial overlords while preserving their own identity. These experiences of submission, accommodation, and quiet persistence would prove invaluable when Assyria later reversed the roles and became the imperial master. The military presence of Akkad in the north was also transformative. Sargon's campaigns demonstrated the power of large organised armies equipped with advanced weaponry and trained in new tactics. The Assyrians, who until then had relied on smaller-scale forces drawn from local populations, now witnessed first-hand the machinery of empire. The memory of Akkadian dominance left a lasting impression. Later Assyrian kings would model their armies on the Akkadian example, eventually surpassing them in scale and efficiency. But in the 3rd millennium BCE, the shadow of Akkad loomed large, reminding the Assyrians of their vulnerability to greater powers. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, further deepened this shadow. Declaring himself King of the Four Quarters, and even adopting the unprecedented title of God of Akkad, Naram-Sin pushed imperial ideology to new heights. His inscriptions describe campaigns in the north, battles against mountain peoples, and the subjugation of rebellious cities. It is possible that Assyrian cities were caught in these struggles, alternately serving as bases for imperial control and as restive territories needing to be pacified. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, depicting the king ascending a mountain while enemies fall before him, captures the image of northern campaigns. For Assyria, this was a time when local autonomy was curtailed, and the presence of Akkadian garrisons ensured compliance. Yet domination was never complete. The Akkadian Empire, vast as it was, faced constant challenges from internal revolts and external threats. In the north, the Hurrians and Gutians tested imperial control, sometimes overwhelming Akkadian forces. When the empire eventually collapsed around 2200 BCE, struck by a combination of invasions, drought and internal decline, Assyrian cities were quick to reassert themselves. Ashur and Nineveh, though weakened, did not vanish. Instead, they endured, their survival testifying to the resilience of northern urban centres. The memory of Akkadian control, however, lingered. It became a historical precedent, showing both the dangers of subordination and the possibilities of empire. Later Assyrian kings looked back on the age of Sargon with a mixture of resentment and admiration. On one hand, Akkadian domination had reduced Assyria to a provincial outpost, its rulers little more than local governors under the shadow of a distant king. On the other hand, the achievements of Sargon and Naram-Sin provided a model of empire that was both awe-inspiring and instructive. The Assyrians learned from their conquerors how to build centralized administrations, how to manage distant territories, and how to use ideology to justify expansion. The very tools of empire that had once enslaved them would later be wielded by Assyrian kings with even greater effect. The Akkadian legacy also influenced language and culture. Akkadian, already spreading as a lingua franca across Mesopotamia, became entrenched in Assyria during this period. The adoption of Akkadian cuneiform for administration and record-keeping cemented cultural ties to the south. Assyrian scribes trained in the Akkadian tradition preserved not only administrative texts, but also literary compositions, myths, and hymns. This transmission ensured that when Assyria later rose to prominence, it did so as both a participant in and a contributor to the broader Mesopotamian cultural world. Without Akkad's influence, the distinctive blend of Assyrian identity, rooted in local traditions yet fluent in imperial culture, might never have taken shape. In this sense, Sargon's shadow was not simply one of oppression, but of inheritance. Assyria inherited the imperial vocabulary of Akkad, the idea of ruling the four quarters of the world, the practice of integrating conquered peoples through governors and tribute, and the use of monumental inscriptions to proclaim royal achievements. These elements became central to Assyrian ideology. When Tiglath-Pileser III, centuries later, reorganized the Assyrian Empire into provinces governed directly by royal officials, he was echoing the precedent set by Sargon. When Ashurnasirpal II inscribed his conquests on palace walls, he was following the example of Naram-Sin. The Akkadian model provided the blueprint, and Assyria would one day refine it to perfection. The fall of Akkad also provided lessons. The empire's collapse, remembered in Mesopotamian tradition as a time of chaos and destruction, underscored the fragility of overextension. Later Assyrian kings, though eager to emulate Akkadian expansion, also remained conscious of the dangers of internal unrest and external invasions. Their policies of mass deportation, brutal suppression, and calculated propaganda can be seen as attempts to prevent the kind of fragmentation that destroyed Akkad. In this sense, Assyria not only inherited Akkadian ambition, but also learned from Akkadian failure. For the people of Ashur and Nineveh, living under the shadow of Akkad was a formative experience. They saw their cities incorporated into a larger political system, their rulers subordinated, their resources extracted, but they also saw the possibilities of empire, the wealth that could flow from trade, the power of organized armies, the prestige of rulers who claimed divine sanction over vast territories. When the Akkadian shadow receded, the Assyrians did not return to obscurity. They carried forward the lessons of subjugation, transforming them into strategies of domination. The shadow of Sargon thus became the seed of Assyrian greatness. In the centuries that followed, Assyria would experience cycles of rise and fall, subordination and resurgence. But the memory of Akkad remained a constant reference point. Sargon's name echoed in Assyrian inscriptions, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as an inspiration. When Assyrian kings built their own empires, they knew they were walking in the footsteps of Akkad. Yet they also believed they were destined to surpass it. The shadow of Akkad was long, but in time the Assyrians would step out of it and cast their own across the ancient world. When the shadow of Akkad faded and the north regained its independence, the city of Ashur turned not first to conquest but to commerce. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, during what scholars call the Old Assyrian period, the merchants of Ashur built one of the most sophisticated trade networks of the ancient world. Their caravans carried goods across hundreds of kilometers, linking Mesopotamia with Anatolia through a web of routes, partnerships, and colonies that stretched across mountains and valleys. This commercial system was not an empire in the military sense, but it functioned with a complexity and efficiency that rivaled political states, and it provided the foundation upon which later Assyrian power would rise. The heart of this network lay in the trading colonies of Anatolia, the most famous of which was at Kanesh, known today as Kultepe. Excavations there have uncovered thousands of clay tablets written in Old Assyrian dialect, providing an unparalleled window into the daily lives of merchants, families and communities. These records are unique in ancient history. They do not consist of royal inscriptions or grand proclamations, but contracts, letters and accounts from private individuals conducting business. Through them, we hear voices that would otherwise be lost, the concerns of traders, the negotiations of families, and the mechanisms of an economy that spanned great distances. The system functioned through caravans of donkeys, which carried tin, textiles, and other goods from Ashur into Anatolia. Tin was especially valuable, for it was a critical component in the production of bronze. Anatolia possessed copper in abundance but lacked sufficient tin, while Mesopotamia had access to tin through trade routes reaching eastward into Iran and beyond. By acting as intermediaries, the Assyrian merchants filled a vital economic niche, supplying Anatolia with the means to produce bronze tools and weapons. In return, they acquired silver, which served as both currency and wealth. This trade was not only profitable, but also strategically significant, linking the economies of Mesopotamia and Anatolia in a system of interdependence. The tablets from Kanesh reveal the intricate mechanisms of this commerce. Merchants organized themselves into family firms, with multiple generations participating in trade. Fathers, sons, brothers and cousins shared responsibilities, invested jointly in caravans and communicated through letters that crisscrossed the region. Wives and daughters also played active roles, managing finances in Ashur, supervising household businesses, and corresponding with absent husbands and brothers. These documents demonstrate that Old Assyrian society was deeply interconnected, with commercial activity shaping not only the economy but also family life and gender roles. Contracts recorded in these archives show the legal sophistication of Assyrian merchants. Agreements specified the division of profits, the responsibilities of caravan leaders, and the penalties for breaches of contract. Loans were common, with interest rates carefully calculated and repayment schedules enforced. Disputes could be brought before local courts, which recognized the authority of Assyrian law even in foreign lands. In some cases, appeals were made to the city of Ashur itself, where higher authorities could intervene. This legal framework ensured trust across long distances, allowing merchants to invest in ventures that might take months or years to yield returns. The stability of this system testifies to the organizational skills of the Assyrians and their ability to project influence without armies. The colonies themselves were not military outposts but residential enclaves embedded within local Anatolian cities. At Kanesh, the Assyrian merchants lived among the local population, maintaining their own houses, warehouses and temples. They paid taxes to local rulers, formed partnerships with local traders, and married into local families. Yet they retained their distinct identity, writing in Assyrian cuneiform, worshipping their own gods, and maintaining close ties to Ashur. This dual existence, integrated yet separate, allowed them to thrive in a foreign environment while preserving their cultural cohesion. The balance they achieved foreshadowed the strategies of later Assyrian empires, which would similarly combine integration with the maintenance of distinct imperial structures. The correspondence between merchants and their families reveals the emotional texture of this world. Letters preserved on clay tablets include appeals for money, reports of profits and losses, and expressions of longing between separated spouses. One wife writes to her husband in Kanesh, urging him to send more silver and reminding him of his obligations at home. Another letter from a father instructs his sons on how to manage a caravan, offering advice born of long experience. These voices humanize the economic system, showing that behind the numbers and contracts were individuals navigating the challenges of distance, uncertainty, and family responsibility. The old Assyrian trading system also sheds light on the role of women. While men dominated long-distance trade, women in Ashur played crucial roles in managing businesses and households. They oversaw weaving workshops that produced textiles for export, invested in caravans, and kept detailed accounts of transactions. The tablets mention women lending money, collecting debts, and even litigating disputes. This participation demonstrates that old Assyrian society allowed significant economic agency for women, at least within the mercantile elite. Their contributions ensured the continuity of the trading system, making them indispensable partners in the enterprise. Politically, the Assyrian trading colonies operated under a delicate balance of autonomy and subordination. The merchants were subject to local Anatolian rulers, paying customs duties and taxes for the right to conduct business. At the same time, they retained allegiance to Ashur, sending a portion of their profits back to their home city. This dual loyalty reflects the flexibility of the system, which relied on negotiation and adaptation rather than force. The Assyrians did not impose their presence through conquest, but through commerce, a strategy that won them acceptance and prosperity. The profits generated by this trade enriched Ashur, funding the growth of the city and the construction of temples and public buildings. The wealth flowing into Assyria during this period provided the resources necessary for political development, strengthening the position of local rulers and laying the foundations for a kingdom. The experience of administering far-flung colonies, enforcing contracts, and resolving disputes also cultivated administrative skills that would later be applied to imperial governance. In a sense, the old Assyrian trading system was a prototype for empire, a demonstration of how networks could be managed across distance and diversity. The decline of this system came not through internal weakness, but through external upheaval. By the 18th century BCE, the political landscape of Anatolia and Mesopotamia was shifting. The rise of powerful states such as the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia and Babylon under Hammurabi disrupted the old networks. Trade routes were destabilized, caravans became vulnerable, and the delicate balance between Assyrian merchants and local rulers broke down. The colony at Kanesh was destroyed by fire, its archives preserved in the ashes. With its collapse, the great age of old Assyrian trade came to an end. Yet the legacy endured. The records preserved at Kanesh ensured that the memory of this system survived, and the experience gained by generations of merchants shaped Assyrian society for centuries. The emphasis on contracts, administration, and long-distance coordination carried over into later periods, when kings applied these principles to the management of empire. The discipline of the merchant became the discipline of the bureaucrat, and the pragmatism of trade became the pragmatism of imperial policy. Even the brutality for which the later Assyrians became famous can be seen as a harsh counterpart to the strict enforcement of commercial contracts in the old Assyrian period. For the people of Ashur, the trading colonies represented both opportunity and risk. They brought wealth, prestige, and cultural connections, but they also demanded sacrifice, as merchants spent years away from home and families endured long separations. The resilience of this society lay in its ability to maintain cohesion across such distances, binding individuals together through law, religion, and shared identity. This resilience would serve Assyria well in later centuries, when it faced challenges far greater than those of commerce. The story of the old Assyrian merchants reminds us that empires are not built by armies alone. Long before Assyria became a military power, it was a commercial power, shaping the ancient world through trade and exchange. The lessons of this era, adaptability, organization, and endurance, remained embedded in Assyrian identity, preparing it for the transformations that lay ahead. When the kings of Assyria later claimed dominion over distant lands, they did so with the confidence of a people who had already managed networks stretching across mountains and continents. The merchants of Ashur, with their caravans of donkeys and their tablets of clay, had shown the way. With the wealth accumulated through commerce and the lessons learned from generations of merchants, Assyria was prepared to make the transition from a city-centered society into a true kingdom. The Old Assyrian period, spanning much of the early 2nd millennium BCE, witnessed the crystallization of royal authority, the growth of monumental temples, and the first experiments in extending power beyond the immediate walls of Ashur. It was in this era that Assyria ceased to be merely a node in wider networks, and began to assert itself as a political and cultural force in its own right. The city of Ashur remained the nucleus of this development. Its dual identity as both a city and the divine embodiment of its patron god gave it a unique structure. Unlike other Mesopotamian centres where rulers claimed to serve ancient cosmic deities with independent cult centres, the rulers of Ashur were directly tied to the god whose very name was identical to the city. To govern Ashur was to govern in the name of Ashur the god, and this provided kings with an unshakable theological foundation. Authority was not portrayed as personal ambition but as sacred stewardship. Even as the political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted with the rise and fall of southern dynasties, this intimate bond between city, god, and ruler granted Assyria an unusual cohesion. The earliest rulers of the old Assyrian kingdom bore titles that reflected this balance between humility and power. They were often called Ishiakum, or stewards, emphasizing that their authority derived from their service to Ashur rather than from personal dominion. Yet beneath this modest title lay the reality of growing royal power. These stewards commanded the loyalty of merchant families, presided over religious ceremonies, and increasingly assumed the role of judges, administrators, and commanders. The old Assyrian king was at once priest, politician, and protector, weaving together roles that would later separate into distinct institutions. Temples formed the physical and symbolic heart of this system. Excavations at Ashur have uncovered evidence of multiple temple complexes dating to this period, each dedicated to deities central to the city's identity. The main temple of Ashur was rebuilt and expanded repeatedly, with each ruler inscribing his contributions on clay or stone. These inscriptions highlight the deep interconnection between kingship and religious devotion. Building and renovating temples was not simply an act of piety, but a declaration of legitimacy. To construct in Ashur's name was to prove oneself a worthy ruler, sanctioned by the divine and visible to the community. The cult of Ishtar also held prominence, particularly in Nineveh, where her temple stood as a major centre of worship. This duality, Ashur as the civic deity of power and order, Ishtar as the goddess of war and fertility, created a balance within the religious landscape of Assyria. Kings patronized both cults, ensuring divine favour in both governance and warfare. The gods were not abstract ideals, but living powers believed to intervene directly in the fate of the kingdom. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals punctuated the calendar, binding the population together in shared observance and reinforcing the authority of rulers who presided over them. The expansion of temples was matched by the growth of palatial architecture. Though modest compared to later Assyrian palaces, the residences of old Assyrian rulers began to take on a monumental character, separate from ordinary dwellings and distinguished by their scale and decoration. Within these palaces, scribes recorded transactions, issued decrees, and stored the correspondence that kept the kingdom functioning. The bureaucracy that would later become synonymous with Assyrian imperial power had its roots here, in the careful records kept by early scribes under royal patronage. The wealth that funded this architecture and administration still flowed primarily from trade, but it was increasingly supplemented by tribute and taxation from surrounding lands. As Ashur's authority grew, nearby settlements were drawn into its orbit, either through alliances or subordination. The early outlines of territorial control began to emerge as Assyria moved beyond being a city-state to becoming a small kingdom with dependent communities. These expansions were modest compared to later imperial conquests, but they marked a critical step in the evolution of Assyrian statehood. Military organisation likewise began to take shape. While still far from the disciplined armies of the Neo-Assyrian period, the forces of the old Assyrian kingdom reflected a growing sophistication. Soldiers were drawn from local populations, equipped with bronze weapons supplied by the same trade networks that sustained the economy. Campaigns were conducted not only for defence but also for the assertion of authority over neighbouring territories. These early expeditions established the precedent that kingship in Assyria was inseparable from the ability to wage war successfully. Victory in battle was framed as proof of divine favour, while defeat threatened the legitimacy of the ruler. The geopolitical context of the early 2nd millennium BCE shaped Assyria's trajectory. To the south, Babylon was rising under Hammurabi, forging a kingdom that would soon dominate Mesopotamia. To the west, Amorite tribes were establishing themselves in Syria. To the east, the Zagros Mountains harboured peoples who alternately traded with and raided Mesopotamian settlements. In this volatile landscape, Assyria had to assert itself carefully, balancing alliances and rivalries while protecting its vital trade routes. The kings of Ashur manoeuvred skillfully, maintaining autonomy while larger powers competed for dominance. This ability to navigate between great empires would remain a hallmark of Assyrian politics for centuries. The consolidation of the old Assyrian kingdom also involved codifying social and legal structures. While most of the surviving law codes come from the Middle Assyrian period, fragments from earlier times suggest that the king was already seen as the guarantor of justice. The application of law to commercial contracts, inheritance disputes, and property transactions reinforced the authority of the state in daily life. Justice was not abstract, but embodied in the figure of the ruler, who dispensed it as part of his divine mandate. This close identification of law with kingship strengthened the unity of the kingdom, while also laying the foundation for the highly codified legal systems of later Assyrian history. The cultural development of this period should not be overlooked. The merchants and scribes of Ashur continue to preserve and transmit literary traditions inherited from earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. Hymns, epics, and myths circulated alongside commercial records, embedding Assyrian identity within the wider cultural continuum of the region. The worship of deities like Enlil and Ishtar connected Assyria to the religious traditions of Sumer and Akkad, even as the cult of Ashur gave the kingdom its unique theological character. This synthesis of local and regional traditions helped ensure Assyria's survival in a competitive environment, as it both participated in and distinguished itself from the broader Mesopotamian world. The Old Assyrian kingdom thus represented a transitional stage. More than a trading community, but not yet an empire. More than a city-state, but not yet a territorial state on the scale of Babylon. Its rulers were kings in name and function, but their authority rested on a delicate balance of trade, religion, and local loyalty. Their achievements were modest in comparison to later Assyrian emperors, yet they were no less foundational. They established the principles of divine kingship, the structures of administration, the integration of trade and tribute, and the intertwining of religion and politics that would define Assyrian identity for centuries. As the 2nd millennium unfolded, these foundations would be tested by new challenges. The rise of Babylon, the incursions of foreign peoples, and the shifting balance of power in Mesopotamia threatened Assyria's independence. Yet the resilience cultivated during the Old Assyrian period enabled the kingdom to endure and adapt. The lessons of stewardship, the centrality of Ashur, and the experience of managing both commerce and politics prepared Assyria for the trials to come. What began as a modest kingdom on the Tigris was slowly hardening into a polity capable of surviving conquest and collapse, and of re-emerging stronger than before. The story of the Old Assyrian kingdom is therefore not one of dazzling conquests or spectacular monuments, but of steady growth, careful adaptation, and durable foundations. Its kings, temples, and early expansions may seem small in scale compared to the grandeur of later Assyrian history, but they were the necessary first steps on the road to empire. The spirit of Ashur, embodied in both city and god, guided these beginnings, ensuring that the kingdom endured through the turbulence of the early 2nd millennium and stood ready for the transformations that lay ahead. The Old Assyrian kingdom had established itself as a stable power rooted in trade, temples, and careful governance. Yet the world around it was far from stable. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, the Near East entered an era of upheaval that historians often call a dark age, not because all life ceased, but because political structures crumbled, records became scarce, and the very survival of long-standing states was thrown into question. For Assyria, this was a time of contraction, vulnerability, and adaptation. The kingdom that had once thrived on Anatolian trade and local expansion now faced external pressure from rival powers and internal strain from economic decline. And yet, unlike so many of its neighbours, Assyria did not vanish. It endured this age of darkness, conserving its traditions, preserving its identity, and waiting for the chance to rise again. The first great blow came from the south. Babylon under Hammurabi had consolidated its dominance in Mesopotamia, and Assyria inevitably found itself within the orbit of this powerful kingdom. Though Hammurabi's empire did not last long after his death, the precedent was set. Assyria was vulnerable to subjugation by larger southern states. For decades, Babylonian rulers asserted authority over Ashur, appointing governors and demanding tribute. Assyria was reduced to a vassal, its independence curtailed. The merchants who had once enriched the city through Anatolian colonies now operated on a smaller scale, their networks disrupted by the shifting tides of power. The city's prosperity declined, and with it, the outward signs of political strength. Yet Assyria's geographic position gave it resilience. Nestled on the Tigris, protected by rivers and rugged terrain, it was difficult to conquer outright. Larger empires could impose tribute and extract loyalty, but they could not easily destroy the city itself. Assyria became a state that could bend without breaking, weathering waves of domination while keeping its core intact. In this sense, its weakness became its strength. While grander empires like Babylon expanded too far and collapsed under their own weight, Assyria conserved its resources, preserving the seed of future revival. The 15th and 14th centuries BCE brought new challenges. To the north and west, the Hittites of Anatolia surged into Syria, clashing with Egyptian armies in their bid for supremacy. To the east, the Hurrians established the kingdom of Mitanni, a formidable power that extended its influence across northern Mesopotamia. It was Mitanni, more than Babylon or the Hittites, that dominated Assyria during this period. For a time, Ashur itself was likely subordinate to Mitanni rulers, its kings reduced to little more than local governors. The Assyrian throne survived in name, but true power lay with foreign overlords. This subordination marked one of the lowest points in Assyrian history. The once ambitious kingdom found itself hemmed in, unable to expand, overshadowed by Mitanni's military and diplomatic reach. Yet the Assyrian kings did not disappear. They continued to rule from Ashur, carrying out rituals, maintaining temples, and preserving continuity in governance. Even as they paid tribute to Mitanni, they cultivated the identity of Assyria as a distinct entity, waiting for the moment when fortune would shift. This quiet persistence during subjugation was one of Assyria's most remarkable traits. Unlike other states that dissolved under foreign rule, Assyria endured, its city god Ashur remaining the axis of loyalty. The archives from this period are sparse, and much of what is known comes from later inscriptions that look back on these years as a time of humiliation. Yet within the silence of the record lies evidence of survival. Temples continued to be built or restored, suggesting that local elites still had resources to invest in religious life. The cult of Ashur did not vanish, and rituals likely bound the community together in times of uncertainty. Families preserved traditions, scribes copied texts, and farmers cultivated the land along the Tigris. Life did not flourish, but it continued, sustaining the structures that would allow Assyria to rise once the shadow of Mitanni faded. The turning point came in the 14th century BCE, when the balance of power in the Near East shifted dramatically. The Hittites launched successful campaigns against Mitanni, weakening the kingdom and creating opportunities for its vassals to assert themselves. At the same time, the Egyptians, under rulers such as Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, pressed into Syria, further destabilizing Mitanni authority. Assyria, caught between these great powers, seized the moment to re-emerge. Ashurbanipal IV, ascending to the throne in the mid-14th century, declared independence from Mitanni and reasserted Assyrian sovereignty. His reign marked the end of Assyria's Dark Age and the beginning of its rise as a major power. But before celebrating the revival, it is worth lingering on the centuries of darkness that preceded it, for they reveal much about the nature of Assyrian resilience. This was a period when records grew thin, when kings wrote little of conquest because they had few to boast of, when the glory of Ashur was muted under foreign domination. And yet, this silence was not emptiness. It was survival. Assyria retained its city, its god, its scribal traditions, and its communal identity. While Mitanni ruled over northern Mesopotamia, Assyria bided its time, keeping alive the framework of kingship and cult that would later empower Ashurbanipal to act decisively. The experience of subjugation also left its mark on Assyrian ideology. Later inscriptions often described Assyria's kings as restorers, figures who revived the power of Ashur after periods of decline. This rhetoric, born in the Dark Age, became a recurring theme throughout Assyrian history. Every revival was framed not as a new creation, but as a restoration of ancient greatness, a return to the favour of Ashur after years of humiliation. The memory of survival through hardship became a permanent part of Assyrian identity, shaping how kings narrated their victories and how people understood their destiny. Economically, the decline of long-distance trade forced Assyria to adapt. With the Anatolian colonies gone, the kingdom turned inward, relying more heavily on local agriculture and regional exchange. While less profitable than the old trade networks, this economy provided a stable base for survival. Fields along the Tigris yielded barley and wheat, flocks provided wool, and artisans continued to produce textiles and pottery. The reduced scale of economic life limited grandeur but ensured continuity. When prosperity returned, Assyria still possessed the agricultural foundation necessary for expansion. Militarily, too, the Age of Darkness shaped Assyria's future. The kingdom lacked the resources to maintain large armies or conduct distant campaigns, but it did not lose the tradition of organised defence. Local forces defended the city and surrounding lands, preserving military practices that could be expanded when resources allowed. The memory of subjugation also instilled in Assyrian rulers a determination never again to be reduced to vassalage. Later, Assyrian brutality, often explained as excessive, can in part be understood as the legacy of these dark years, a refusal to tolerate threats, a drive to dominate rather than risk domination. The cultural continuity of Assyria during this period was equally significant. Even as political power waned, scribes continued to copy and preserve Mesopotamian literature. Myths, epics, hymns, and legal texts survived in Assyrian hands, ensuring that when the kingdom revived, it did so as part of the broader Mesopotamian cultural tradition. The god Ashur remained central, but Assyria's identity was enriched by the shared heritage of Mesopotamia. This combination of local devotion and regional participation gave Assyria a dual strength, grounding it in tradition while connecting it to a larger world. Thus, the Age of Darkness was not a void but a crucible. It tested Assyria's endurance, stripping away wealth and independence, but in doing so, it forged resilience. The kingdom learned to survive under foreign domination, to preserve its core institutions in times of weakness, and to cultivate an identity that could endure humiliation without dissolution. These lessons would shape its destiny in the centuries ahead, when Assyria not only regained independence, but built one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. When Ashurbanipal declared independence and began to expand Assyria's power once more, he did so upon the foundations laid during these dark centuries. The temples, the scribal schools, the loyalty to Ashur, and the memory of survival all provided the bedrock for revival. What had seemed like centuries of stagnation were, in retrospect, centuries of preservation. Assyria had endured where others had fallen, and that endurance became the hallmark of its history. The darkness did not extinguish the flame of Ashur. It only shielded it until it could burn again more brightly. The centuries of darkness that had weighed upon Assyria began to lift in the 14th century BCE, when Ashurbanipal seized the moment to declare independence from Mitanni and establish Assyria once more as a sovereign kingdom. This act was not just a political maneuver, but a turning point that marked the dawn of the Middle Assyrian period. What followed over the next 3 centuries was a remarkable transformation, as Assyria expanded its power beyond its city walls, codified its legal and administrative systems, and began to project itself as an empire in the making. This was an era when Assyria emerged from the shadows of greater states and began to carve its own place as a formidable power in the ancient Near East. Ashurbanipal's reign, beginning around 1365 BCE, set the tone. With Mitanni weakened by Hittite attacks and Egyptian pressure, he proclaimed Assyria's independence and adopted the title of king, elevating himself beyond the earlier, more modest designation of steward of Ashur. This shift in titulature reflected more than personal ambition. It signalled the maturation of Assyrian kingship into a fully sovereign institution. The king was now not only the servant of Ashur but also the embodiment of Assyrian sovereignty, charged with defending the land, leading armies, and representing Assyria in the community of states. Diplomacy quickly followed independence. Ashurbanipal established direct contact with Egypt, sending letters to pharaohs of the Amarna age and asserting Assyria's place alongside the great powers of the Near East. These letters, preserved in the Amarna archive, reveal both the ambition and the insecurity of early Middle Assyrian kingship. On the one hand, Assyria demanded recognition as an equal to Babylon, Hatti, and Egypt. On the other hand, the letters betray anxiety about Assyria's fragile position, still vulnerable to its more established rivals. Yet the very fact that Assyria corresponded with Egypt at this level marked a dramatic step forward from the subordination of earlier centuries. Internally, Ashurbanipal and his successors strengthened Assyrian control by centralizing administration and extending authority over surrounding territories. The city of Ashur remained the heart, but new centres of power began to emerge, linked by roads, garrisons, and provincial governors. This was the early blueprint of an empire. Local rulers were replaced or subordinated, tribute was imposed, and Assyrian officials ensured loyalty. The integration of territory required not just military force but also administrative innovation, and the Middle Assyrian state began to craft mechanisms of governance that would later define its imperial character. The military too underwent transformation. Whereas earlier armies had been largely temporary levies, the Middle Assyrian state developed a more permanent and organised system of conscription. Free men were required to serve, often providing their own equipment, while the state supplied chariots, horses, and specialised weaponry. Chariots in particular became symbols of Assyrian military strength, providing mobility and shock power in battle. Campaigns were launched annually, both to defend borders and to expand territory, establishing the rhythm of constant warfare that would become a hallmark of Assyrian kingship. Victory in these campaigns was celebrated as proof of Ashur's favour, reinforcing the ideological connection between military success and divine legitimacy. The Middle Assyrian kings were also builders, and their inscriptions emphasised the construction and renovation of temples and palaces. These projects were not mere displays of wealth, but acts of devotion that tied royal authority to divine sanction. By expanding the Temple of Ashur, rulers demonstrated their piety and their central role as mediators between God and people. The palace, meanwhile, symbolised royal power in the earthly realm, housing the bureaucracy that managed the growing kingdom. Together, temple and palace embodied the dual foundation of Assyrian rule: divine stewardship and earthly authority. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Middle Assyrian period, however, was its legal and administrative codification. The so-called Middle Assyrian laws, inscribed on clay tablets, represent one of the most detailed legal collections from the ancient world. These laws covered matters ranging from property and inheritance to social conduct and punishment. They reveal a society deeply concerned with hierarchy, discipline, and control. Harsh penalties were prescribed for offences, including mutilation for certain crimes, reflecting an emphasis on deterrence and social order. The laws also codified gender relations, property rights, and the obligations of subjects, embedding Assyrian authority into the fabric of daily life. What is striking about these laws is not simply their severity, but their reflection of a state seeking to regulate all aspects of society. They illustrate the ambition of the Middle Assyrian kings to extend their authority into households, contracts, and communities, ensuring that no sphere was beyond the reach of state power. This legal codification paralleled the growth of provincial administration, in which governors enforced royal decrees and collected tribute on behalf of the crown. The Middle Assyrian period thus witnessed the emergence of a state apparatus capable of sustaining expansion over time and distance. Expansion itself proceeded in fits and starts, as Assyria tested its strength against rivals. Ashurbanipal secured gains in the north and east, bringing formerly Mitanni-held territories under Assyrian control. His successors, such as Adad-nirari-tharim, consolidated these conquests and pressed further, defeating Mitanni remnants and challenging Babylonian influence. Adad-nirari's inscriptions proudly proclaim his victories and the subjugation of foreign kings, marking a new confidence in Assyria's military and political power. He also reorganized conquered territories into provinces, setting the stage for a system of direct rule that would later become the hallmark of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. One of the key features of Middle Assyrian expansion was the policy of deportation. Captives from conquered lands were relocated into Assyrian territory, where they served as labourers, artisans, or soldiers. This practice served multiple purposes. It weakened defeated populations, increased Assyria's manpower, and integrated diverse peoples into the kingdom. Deportation would later become infamous under the Neo-Assyrians, but its roots lay in this earlier period, when the logic of conquest demanded both control and utility. By transplanting populations, the Assyrian state reshaped demographics and extended its influence in ways that military victory alone could not achieve. The theological dimension of Middle Assyrian kingship also developed during this era. Inscriptions describe kings as chosen by Ashur to expand the borders of the land, to bring order to chaos, and to enforce divine justice. Military campaigns were framed not as acts of aggression but as sacred duties, carried out in the name of the god. This intertwining of religious obligation and political ambition gave Assyrian expansion a sense of inevitability. To resist Assyria was to resist Ashur, and to be defeated by Assyria was to be placed under divine order. Such rhetoric justified conquest and reinforced loyalty among subjects who saw themselves as part of a divinely sanctioned enterprise. Yet this period was not without setbacks. The great powers of the Near East remained formidable, and Assyria's expansion was checked at times by Babylon, the Hittites, and Elam. Border conflicts flared repeatedly, and victories were often temporary. The Middle Assyrian kings lacked the overwhelming resources that later Neo-Assyrian rulers would command, and their empire remained limited in scope. Still, their achievements were significant. They secured independence, established Assyria as a regional power, codified its laws, and built the foundations of a state capable of imperial ambition. The legacy of the Middle Assyrian Empire lies not in the sheer scale of its conquests, but in the structures it created. The codification of law, the organization of provinces, the policy of deportation, and the ideology of divine kingship all became defining features of later Assyrian power. The experiences of this period taught the Assyrians how to manage diversity, enforce discipline, and sustain expansion. These lessons were carried forward, refined, and magnified in the centuries to come. From the perspective of later history, the Middle Assyrian Empire stands as a bridge. It connected the modest kingdom of earlier centuries with the global empire of the first millennium BCE. Without the institutional and ideological developments of this period, the later achievements of Assyria would have been impossible. The rise of the Middle Assyrian state thus marks a crucial chapter in the long journey of Assyria from survival to supremacy. It was in this era that Assyria ceased to be merely a regional kingdom and became a state with imperial ambition, a state that believed itself destined to rule far beyond the banks of the Tigris. As the 13th century BCE unfolded, the momentum of this rise would only accelerate. Kings like Shalmaneser I and Tukulti-Ninurta pushed Assyrian power outward, challenging old rivals and experimenting with new forms of imperial control. What began with Ashurbanipal's declaration of independence blossomed into a century of conquest and consolidation, laying the groundwork for Assyria's first true empire. As the Middle Assyrian state expanded, it became increasingly clear that military strength was not merely an occasional necessity, but the very foundation of Assyria's existence. Unlike some kingdoms that relied on diplomacy or geography for protection, Assyria lived in a dangerous corridor, hemmed in by rivals on all sides. To survive, it had to fight, and to dominate, it had to fight constantly. This relentless reality shaped the kingdom's institutions, culture, and ideology, giving rise to a military system unlike anything seen before. Over time, Assyria transformed the ad hoc militias and levies of earlier ages into an organized, disciplined, and professional force that stood at the heart of its empire. In the earliest centuries of Assyrian expansion, chariots were the hallmark of power. Introduced to Mesopotamia from the steppe cultures to the north and east, chariots revolutionized warfare by providing mobility, speed, and shock power. Assyrian kings quickly adopted and refined their use, fielding squadrons of chariots that could dominate open battlefields. These vehicles were drawn by horses, which themselves required careful breeding, training, and management. The chariot was both a weapon and a statement, a symbol of wealth, technology, and military sophistication. To command chariots was to demonstrate mastery over resources and logistics, for they demanded stables, grooms, smiths, and a network of supply. The image of the king riding in his chariot, bow in hand, became one of the most enduring symbols of Assyrian authority. In inscriptions and reliefs, rulers depicted themselves not simply as administrators or priests, but as warriors leading from the front, guiding chariots into the thick of battle. This martial imagery reinforced the ideology that the king was chosen by Ashur to conquer and protect, his victories serving as proof of divine favour. The chariot, therefore, was not only a tactical tool, but also a stage on which kingship itself was performed. Yet the Assyrians were never content to remain static. They continually experimented with military organisation, seeking to improve mobility and effectiveness. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, they began developing cavalry units, a significant innovation that would eventually reshape warfare across the ancient world. Riding horses directly, rather than harnessing them to chariots, allowed for greater flexibility and faster manoeuvres, particularly in rough terrain where chariots struggled. At first, cavalrymen likely rode in pairs, one holding the reins while the other shot arrows, but over time, equipment and techniques improved, allowing individual riders to fight effectively. The introduction of cavalry marked a turning point, for it provided Assyria with an advantage that few rivals could match. Managing cavalry required not only training riders but also developing saddles, harnesses, and techniques to control horses in combat. It also required breeding programs to produce strong, resilient animals. Assyrian kings invested heavily in these efforts, establishing royal stables and employing specialists who ensured the quality of their cavalry forces. This attention to detail illustrates the systematic approach of Assyrian military organization, where every innovation was institutionalized and expanded. Infantry, however, remained the backbone of the army, and here too the Assyrians excelled. Unlike the levied militias of earlier Mesopotamian states, Assyria developed a corps of trained soldiers who served on a regular basis. These men were equipped with standardized weapons, spears, swords, shields, and later iron equipment as metallurgy advanced. They fought in coordinated units, drilled to operate in formation and to follow orders with discipline. This professionalism distinguished the Assyrian army from its contemporaries, many of whom still relied on seasonal levies of farmers turned soldiers. Assyria's forces could campaign year after year, sustaining military pressure in ways that others could not. The organisation of the army reflected the broader structure of the state. Governors were responsible for levying troops in their provinces, while royal officials managed supplies, equipment and pay. Soldiers were rewarded with rations, land grants or shares of plunder, creating incentives for loyalty and performance. Specialised units emerged, including archers, slingers and engineers capable of constructing siege equipment. This diversification gave Assyria a flexibility in battle that few could match. Whether facing open field encounters, mountainous terrain, or fortified cities, the Assyrians had the tools and personnel to adapt. Siege warfare became an Assyrian specialty. The Near East was filled with fortified cities, and to expand, Assyria had to master the art of breaching walls. Their armies developed battering rams, towers and scaling ladders, and employed engineers who could undermine walls or divert water supplies. Reliefs from later centuries depict these sieges in vivid detail, showing soldiers advancing under cover, archers providing suppressing fire, and machines crashing against gates. While much of this imagery comes from the Neo-Assyrian period, its roots lay in the Middle Assyrian Age, when the systematic approach to warfare took shape. The siege was not just a test of strength, but a demonstration of the army's organisation and the state's logistical capacity. Logistics were indeed at the core of Assyrian success. To maintain a professional army, the kingdom had to feed, equip, and transport thousands of soldiers across long distances. Supply depots, roads, and administrative records ensured that grain, weapons, and animals reached the front lines. This infrastructure tied the military directly to the bureaucracy, making war not a seasonal activity but a permanent institution of the state. The Assyrian king was not simply a war leader. He was the supreme organizer of a military machine that integrated every aspect of society into its functioning. This integration extended to conquered peoples as well. Captives were conscripted into the army, serving as auxiliaries or labourers. Skilled artisans were employed to build weapons and machines, while others provided logistical support. By incorporating foreigners into its ranks, Assyria expanded its manpower and diversified its expertise. This practice also weakened defeated populations, dispersing them and reducing their capacity to rebel. The army thus became not only a tool of conquest but also an instrument of assimilation, reshaping the demographics of the empire while sustaining its strength. Ideologically, warfare was inseparable from religion. Campaigns were launched in the name of Ashur, and victories were celebrated as divine acts. The king portrayed himself as the earthly agent of the god, fulfilling a sacred duty to expand Assyria's borders and impose order on chaos. Defeat, conversely, was framed as a temporary withdrawal of divine favour, demanding renewed devotion and stricter enforcement of order. This theological framework gave warfare a moral dimension, justifying its brutality and inspiring loyalty among troops who saw themselves as part of a cosmic struggle. The brutality of Assyrian warfare became legendary, though it should be understood in context. Inscriptions boast of defeated enemies being flayed, impaled, or mutilated, acts designed to instill terror and discourage resistance. While shocking to modern sensibilities, these practices were consistent with a strategy of psychological warfare. By demonstrating the consequences of defiance, Assyria sought to reduce the need for prolonged resistance. Terror was a weapon as real as any sword or spear, and the Assyrians wielded it with calculated precision. This approach was rooted in the Middle Assyrian period, where the ideology of total submission to Ashur began to take shape. The cumulative result of these developments was the creation of what can justly be called the first professional army in history. Unlike other states that relied on temporary levies, Assyria maintained a standing force trained, equipped, and organised for continuous war. This army was not an appendage of the state. It was the state's very core, the institution around which politics, economy, and ideology revolved. The professionalisation of the military transformed Assyria from a regional kingdom into an expanding power capable of projecting authority across the Near East. This transformation did not occur overnight, nor was it always smooth. Resources were strained, defeats occurred, and rivals remained formidable. But the direction was unmistakable. Assyria was becoming a militarized society, where every aspect of life, law, economy, religion, and administration, was oriented towards sustaining war. This orientation would shape Assyria's destiny, driving its rise to imperial heights and eventually contributing to its downfall. For in creating a state so dependent on military dominance, Assyria ensured both its strength and its vulnerability. As the 13th and 12th centuries BCE unfolded, the fruits of this system became evident. Kings like Ashurnasirpal and Tukulti-Ninurta led campaigns that extended Assyrian control deep into Mesopotamia, Syria, and beyond. Their victories were not fleeting raids but sustained conquests, supported by the professional army and the administrative apparatus that maintained it. These conquests demonstrated the effectiveness of the new military system and laid the foundation for the imperial structure that would dominate the first millennium. In this way, Assyrian warfare was more than a matter of battles and weapons. It was a cultural and institutional revolution that redefined what a state could be. By creating the first professional army, Assyria pioneered a model of a military organisation that influenced later empires and altered the course of history. The chariot, the cavalry, the disciplined infantry, the engineers, the logistics. All these elements combined into a machine that turned Assyria from a city on the Tigris into a force that reshaped the ancient world. The rise of Assyria in the Middle Assyrian period was inseparable from the deeds of a succession of kings, whose reigns both consolidated and extended the foundations laid in earlier centuries. Among them, Ashurbanipal, Adad-nirari-Giam, and Tukulti-Ninurta stand as pivotal figures. Their reigns, spanning roughly the 14th to 12th centuries BCE, mark the progression of Assyria from survival and revival to confident assertion of power, from the careful steps of a state emerging from subjugation to the bolder strides of a kingdom seeking to dominate its neighbours. Through conquest, diplomacy, and monumental construction, these kings inscribed themselves into the story of Assyria not only as warriors but as builders, administrators, and shapers of institutions that would endure long after their deaths. Ashurbanipal, ascending the throne in the mid-14th century BCE, was the king who broke Assyria free from Mitanni domination and proclaimed its independence. His reign represented the culmination of years of quiet survival under foreign rule, and his decision to assert sovereignty reflected both opportunism and vision. With Mitanni weakened by conflict with the Hittites and Egyptians, Ashurbanipal seized the chance to elevate Assyria to the status of a great power. He corresponded directly with the Egyptian pharaohs, inserting Assyria into the diplomatic system that bound together the major states of the Near East. These Amarna letters reveal a king conscious of his newfound stature, eager to be recognized as an equal among the mighty rulers of Babylon, Hatti, and Egypt. Yet Ashurbanipal's ambitions went beyond diplomacy. He intervened in Babylonian politics, supporting his grandson on the Babylonian throne, and thereby entangling Assyria in southern affairs. Though this intervention ultimately provoked conflict, it demonstrated a new boldness, as Assyria no longer accepted subordination, but sought to influence the fate of its rivals. Militarily, Ashurbanipal campaigned successfully against Mitanni remnants, and secured Assyria's frontiers, ensuring that the kingdom's independence would not be easily reversed. His reign marked the beginning of Assyria's ascent, and his achievements established a precedent for future kings to build upon. Adad-nirari I, who reigned in the late 14th and early 13th centuries BCE, carried this legacy further. He is remembered as one of the first Assyrian kings to adopt a more imperial rhetoric, proclaiming himself not merely king of Assur, but ruler over conquered lands. His inscriptions describe the subjugation of former Mitanni territories and the imposition of Assyrian control over vast stretches of northern Mesopotamia. The campaigns of Adad-nirari were not fleeting raids, but sustained efforts to bring foreign lands under permanent Assyrian authority. Governors were appointed, tribute was collected, and provincial administration expanded. The notion of empire, still in its infancy, began to take shape under his rule. Adad-nirari's building projects mirrored his military achievements. He undertook significant renovations of temples, particularly the Temple of Ashur, demonstrating his devotion to the city god who sanctioned his reign. Inscriptions proudly record these efforts, intertwining religious piety with political legitimacy. By expanding temples and palaces, he both honoured the gods and projected the grandeur of his kingship. Architecture became a language of power, visible to subjects and foreigners alike. To build was to demonstrate control over resources, labour, and the blessings of the divine. The physical landscape of Assyria was reshaped in this period, with monumental structures that announced the kingdom's growing might. The reign of Adad-nirari also highlights the Assyrian practice of deportation, already emerging as a tool of statecraft. Conquered peoples were resettled in Assyrian territory, where they served as labourers, artisans, or soldiers. This policy not only provided manpower for building projects and campaigns, but also diluted the strength of subject populations, reducing the risk of rebellion. It was an early example of the pragmatic ruthlessness that characterized Assyrian rule, combining utility with control. The kingdom was no longer content to demand tribute. It sought to reshape the human geography of its empire. If Ashurbanipal had laid the foundation and Adad-nirari had expanded upon it, Tukulti-Ninurta I in the late 13th century BCE pushed Assyria to new heights. His reign epitomized the ambition and aggression that came to define Assyrian kingship. He campaigned extensively, defeating the Hittites in the north, conquering territories in the Zagros, and most dramatically launching a successful invasion of Babylon. For the first time in history, Assyrian armies captured Babylon itself, long the cultural and political rival to the south. Tukulti-Ninurta's conquest shocked Mesopotamia, signalling that Assyria had risen to a position of unparalleled strength. The capture of Babylon was not merely symbolic. Tukulti-Ninurta took the Babylonian king prisoner and carried off the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, to Ashur. This act was more than plunder. It was a profound statement of dominance, intended to humiliate Babylon and exalt Assyria. To seize a god statue was to claim authority over that deity and his people, to assert that their fate lay in the hands of Assyria's king and Ashur's will. The audacity of this act underscored Tukulti-Ninurta's ambition and his belief in Assyria's divine mission. Yet his reign was not only about conquest. Tukulti-Ninurta was also a builder of cities. Dissatisfied with Ashur, he founded a new capital, Tukulti-Ninurta, just across the Tigris. This city included a grand palace, temples, and administrative buildings, reflecting his desire to establish a seat of power commensurate with his achievements. The decision to build a new capital symbolized both ambition and a break with tradition, for it signaled a king who sought to redefine the geography of Assyrian power. Though the city would not outlast him, its creation illustrates the grand scale of his vision. Tukulti-Ninurta's reign also left an intellectual legacy. He is associated with the composition of epic poetry, including the so-called Epic of Tukulti-Ninurta, which celebrated his conquests in elevated language. This blending of literature and politics highlights the cultural dimension of Assyrian kingship, where victories were not only recorded in inscriptions, but also immortalized in poetic form. The king was presented not only as a warrior, but as a figure of cosmic significance, chosen by Ashur to restore order to the world. Such rhetoric elevated Assyrian kingship beyond mere politics, embedding it within a larger narrative of divine destiny. However, Tukulti-Ninurta's reign also reveals the tensions inherent in Assyrian power. His conquests and innovations generated resentment among elites, and his reign ended in rebellion, with his own sons turning against him. He was assassinated, and his new capital fell into decline. This violent end underscores the fragility of even the mightiest Assyrian kingship, where the same ambition that expanded the kingdom could also destabilize it. The cycle of conquest and consolidation was always precarious, balanced on the loyalty of nobles, the success of armies, and the favour of Ashur. Taken together, the reigns of Ashur-uballit, Adad-nirari, and Tukulti-Ninurta illustrate the trajectory of Middle Assyrian power, each built upon the achievements of his predecessor, expanding territory, codifying institutions, and reshaping the kingdom's identity. They were kings and builders in the fullest sense, conquerors who extended Assyria's reach, patrons who constructed temples and palaces, and visionaries who articulated a new role for Assyria in the world. Their legacies endured in the structures they created, both physical and institutional, even when their reigns ended in turmoil. Through their efforts, Assyria evolved from a regional kingdom into a power of imperial ambition. The notion that Assyria was destined to rule others, sanctioned by Ashur and realized through conquest and construction, became firmly established. The professional army, the legal codes, the deportation policies, the monumental building projects, all these elements coalesced in this era, setting the stage for the greater empires that would follow. And yet, as powerful as these kings were, they remained part of a longer continuum. Their achievements would be tested by new challenges, as the late second millennium brought renewed instability, invasions, and shifts in the balance of power. The memory of their conquests and constructions, however, would inspire later rulers who looked back to Ashur-uballit, Adad-nirari, and Tukulti-Ninurta as models of kingship. In their successes and failures alike, they defined what it meant to be an Assyrian king in an age of transition, preparing the ground for the transformations yet to come. By the close of the second millennium BCE, Assyria had already known cycles of triumph and collapse, expansion and retreat. The Middle Assyrian kings had built a formidable state, but the turbulence of the Late Bronze Age, the invasions, migrations, and systemic collapse that swept across the Near East around 1200 BCE left their kingdom weakened. For a time, Assyria survived in relative obscurity, holding on to its core territories while others fell around it. Yet this period of survival was not stagnation. It was a time of gestation, in which the political, military, and administrative traditions of the Middle Assyrian kingdom were preserved, waiting for a new era to transform them into the foundations of empire. When the Neo-Assyrian period dawned in the 9th century BCE, the kingdom re-emerged with a vigour that would reshape the ancient world. The Neo-Assyrian revolution was not a sudden break, but a gradual reorganisation of state and society that allowed Assyria to extend its power on a scale no Near Eastern state had achieved before. At the heart of this transformation was the recognition that conquest alone was not enough. The new empire had to sustain its dominance through administration, ideology, and the systematic integration of conquered peoples. What distinguished the Neo-Assyrian state from its predecessors was not simply its military might, but its ability to govern vast and diverse territories under a centralized system that fused military organization with bureaucratic control. The kings who spearheaded this revolution, Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, and their successors, understood that Assyria could no longer operate as a traditional kingdom, expanding and contracting with each campaign. Instead, it had to reinvent itself as an imperial machine, capable of constant projection of power and efficient extraction of resources from a wide array of subject lands. This meant new strategies of conquest, new methods of administration, and new ways of presenting kingship itself. The king was no longer merely the ruler of Ashur, but the king of the universe, the sovereign of all lands and peoples. The military remained the spearhead of this transformation. The professional army, already taking shape in the Middle Assyrian period, was expanded, diversified, and refined. Cavalry became more central, replacing chariots as the core of elite forces. Siege warfare reached new heights of sophistication, with elaborate engines, ramps, and towers enabling the capture of even the most heavily fortified cities. But the real revolution lay in scale. Campaigns were no longer seasonal raids, but continuous operations year after year, projecting Assyrian power across Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and eventually as far as Egypt. The army became a permanent institution, its commanders drawn from the royal elite, its logistics supported by a bureaucracy that ensured constant supply of men, animals, and provisions. Yet conquest was only the beginning. Once territories were subdued, the Assyrians implemented a system of provincial administration that turned conquered lands into extensions of the Assyrian heartland. Governors appointed by the king oversaw taxation, law, and military levies. Roads and communication networks connected distant provinces to the capital, enabling swift movement of troops and information. The empire was divided into manageable units, each bound by loyalty to the crown, but integrated into a system that could extract resources efficiently. This administrative innovation allowed Assyria to maintain control over a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. The policy of deportation, already practiced in the Middle Assyrian period, was expanded to unprecedented scale. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled in distant parts of the empire, breaking local resistance and repopulating areas that needed labour or soldiers. Far from being random brutality, this was a calculated strategy of imperial management. By scattering subject peoples, the Assyrians both prevented rebellion and wove a tapestry of diverse communities tied together by dependency on the state. This policy not only reshaped the demographics of the Near East, but also left a legacy that endured for centuries as displaced populations carried their traditions and languages across the empire. Ideology was another pillar of the Neo-Assyrian Revolution. The king was presented as the chosen instrument of Ashur, destined to bring order to the world. Royal inscriptions and palace reliefs celebrated victories with graphic detail, depicting conquered peoples kneeling in submission or suffering the horrors of defiance. These images were not mere boasts, they were tools of psychological warfare, meant to intimidate enemies and reassure subjects of Assyria's invincibility. The brutality so often associated with Assyria was part of a calculated performance, reinforcing the ideology that resistance was futile and submission inevitable. Architecture played a central role in projecting this ideology. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II built grand new capitals such as Kalhu, Nimrud, filled with palaces decorated with reliefs that told the story of conquest and divine favour. These monumental projects were both functional administrative centres and symbolic statements of power. The scale of construction reflected the resources of empire, while the art that adorned the walls communicated the ideology of Assyrian dominance. Visitors walking through these palaces were confronted with scenes of kings hunting lions, leading armies, and receiving tribute, all reinforcing the message that the king was the axis of the world. The Neo-Assyrian Revolution also involved the expansion of diplomatic and economic networks. Tribute flowed into the empire not only as a form of submission, but as a means of integrating conquered regions into a larger economic system. Luxury goods from distant lands, metals, horses, and exotic animals were collected, enriching the Assyrian elite and fueling further campaigns. Assyrian kings corresponded with rulers of smaller states, demanding loyalty and threatening punishment for disobedience. The empire's reach extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the politics and economies of neighbouring lands through both intimidation and incorporation. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Neo-Assyrian transformation was its cultural inclusiveness. While Assyrian ideology emphasized domination, the empire also absorbed and adapted the traditions of conquered peoples. Art, architecture, language and literature from Babylonia, Syria and beyond were incorporated into Assyrian culture, enriching it and making the empire a centre of exchange. The famous library of Ashurbanipal, established later in the Neo-Assyrian period, reflects this synthesis, preserving texts from across Mesopotamia and ensuring that the intellectual traditions of the region survived. In this sense, Assyria's brutality coexisted with a cosmopolitanism that allowed it to serve as a cultural crossroads. The Neo-Assyrian Revolution thus represented a fundamental shift in the nature of statehood. Where earlier kingdoms had risen and fallen, expanding temporarily before retreating into their heartlands, Assyria created a system designed for permanence. Conquest, administration, ideology, and culture were all integrated into a coherent framework that sustained imperial dominance for centuries. It was a model of empire that would influence later powers, from the Persians to the Romans. At the same time, this revolution came with costs. The very structures that made Assyria powerful also made it dependent on continuous expansion and constant warfare. The army had to be fed with victories, the bureaucracy had to be financed with tribute, and the ideology of divine kingship demanded ever greater demonstrations of conquest. Assyria had built a machine that could not easily stop, for to halt expansion was to invite stagnation and weakness. This paradox lay at the heart of the empire's destiny, propelling it to greatness, but also setting the stage for its eventual collapse. As the 9th and 8th centuries BCE unfolded, the Neo-Assyrian state reached new heights under kings who embraced this revolutionary system. They extended Assyrian power to the Mediterranean coast, subdued powerful rivals like Urartu, and even reached into Egypt. They built vast cities, codified administrative practices, and cultivated an image of invincibility. The Assyrian Empire became the superpower of the ancient world, feared, admired, and hated in equal measure. What began as a local kingdom on the Tigris had transformed into the first great world empire, a model of imperial ambition that would echo through history. When Ashurnasirpal II came to the throne in the early 9th century BCE, Assyria was already on a trajectory of expansion and transformation, but it was under his rule that the empire's ambitions crystallized into concrete reality. His reign stands as one of the decisive moments in Assyrian history, a period when military conquest, administrative reform, ideological assertion, and monumental construction converged to establish a model of kingship that would endure for generations. Ashurnasirpal II was not merely a ruler of Assyria, he was the architect of its imperial identity, and through him the city of Kalhu rose from obscurity to become the heart of a resurgent power. The world into which Ashurnasirpal II stepped was one of opportunity and challenge. To the north, the kingdom of Urartu was beginning to consolidate in the Armenian highlands, threatening Assyria's flank. To the west, the small but wealthy states of Syria controlled trade routes to the Mediterranean, while further south, Babylon remained both rival and potential prize. Assyria had survived the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age with its core intact, but to secure dominance it needed aggressive leadership. Ashurnasirpal provided precisely that, launching campaigns that expanded Assyrian influence farther than any of his predecessors had achieved. The annals of his reign, preserved on stone inscriptions, leave no doubt as to the scale and ferocity of his military ventures. Year after year he led armies across the mountains and plains, subduing tribes, besieging cities, and exacting tribute from rulers who dared resist. His campaigns extended into Anatolia, the Levant, and deep into the Zagros Mountains. The rhetoric of these inscriptions is unflinching, dwelling on the terror he inflicted upon enemies, impalements, flayings, and massacres described in stark detail. These acts, often interpreted as cruelty for cruelty's sake, were in fact calculated elements of a broader strategy of psychological warfare. Ashurnasirpal sought not only to defeat his enemies, but to break their will to resist, to ensure that submission would be swift and lasting. Yet behind this fearsome image lay a systematic approach to empire. Ashurnasirpal too understood that conquest alone could not sustain Assyrian power. Territories once subdued had to be integrated into the imperial system. He strengthened the provincial administration, placing loyal governors in key cities, and expanded the use of deportation to resettle conquered peoples within Assyrian domains. This served the dual purpose of weakening defeated populations and providing the empire with a steady supply of labour for agriculture, construction, and the army. It was during his reign that deportation became a regular and large-scale policy, a hallmark of Neo-Assyrian governance that would shape the demographic map of the Near East. The administrative reforms of Ashurnasirpal were matched by his vision as a builder. Dissatisfied with the old capital at Ashur, he chose to establish a new royal centre at Kalhu, a city located at a strategic bend of the Tigris. The decision to build a new capital was bold, for it required enormous resources in labour, materials, and planning. But Ashurnasirpal was determined to create a city that would embody the grandeur of his reign and the power of Assyria. Kalhu was transformed almost overnight, as deported labourers and local workers built walls, palaces, temples, and gardens on a monumental scale. At the heart of Kalhu stood the Northwest Palace, a vast complex that served as both royal residence and administrative hub. Its walls were lined with stone reliefs that depicted the king's campaigns, his victories over enemies, and his role as protector of the realm. These reliefs, some of which survive to this day, offer a vivid glimpse into the ideological program of Ashurnasirpal's kingship. Scenes of lion hunts symbolized his mastery over chaos, while depictions of tribute-bearers emphasized the submission of distant lands. The palace was not merely a dwelling. It was a stage on which the ideology of empire was performed, a visual narrative that reinforced the message of Assyrian dominance. Temples also played a central role in the new capital. Ashurnasirpal rebuilt the temple of Ninurta, the war god, and other shrines dedicated to Assyria's pantheon. By investing in these sacred structures, he underscored the divine sanction of his rule. The gods, especially Ashur, were portrayed as willing participants in Assyria's conquests, granting victory and prosperity in return for piety and dedication. The physical presence of these temples within Kalhu reinforced the inseparability of political and religious authority, making the city a microcosm of Assyrian ideology. The creation of Kalhu was accompanied by a spectacle of royal propaganda. Ashurnasirpal famously invited thousands of guests, perhaps as many as 70,000, to a grand festival celebrating the completion of his palace. Detailed records of the event list the enormous quantities of food and drink consumed, from cattle and sheep to bread, wine, and beer. This feast was more than indulgence. It was a calculated display of abundance and generosity, demonstrating that under the king's rule, Assyria was a land of plenty. The festival projected an image of stability, prosperity, and divine favour, reassuring allies and intimidating rivals alike. In Kalhu, Ashurnasirpal also established gardens watered by a complex system of canals, bringing exotic plants and animals from across the empire. These gardens symbolized not only wealth and luxury, but also the king's ability to control nature itself. By transplanting flora and fauna from distant lands, he turned his capital into a living map of empire, a place where the diversity of Assyria's domains was gathered and displayed. Later traditions would remember the Assyrians, and especially their successors in Babylon, as creators of wondrous gardens that symbolized imperial majesty. In this too, Ashurnasirpal was a pioneer. The reign of Ashurnasirpal II marked a turning point in Assyrian history. because it demonstrated the full integration of military power, administrative control, and ideological projection. He was not content to win battles. He sought to reshape the very landscape of Assyria, physically and symbolically. Kalhu was both a capital and a manifesto, proclaiming to all who entered its gates that Assyria had entered a new age. His campaigns extended Assyrian influence across the Near East. His administrative reforms secured those gains, and his building projects embodied the grandeur of his reign. But Ashurnasirpal's legacy was not without its contradictions. The terror he inspired created loyalty born of fear, a powerful but unstable foundation. His relentless campaigns strained resources and provoked resistance, forcing his successors to continue the cycle of conquest in order to sustain the empire. The very policies that strengthened Assyria also locked it into a system of perpetual warfare and expansion. Yet without his vision and determination, the Assyrian Empire might never have achieved the heights it later reached. In the centuries that followed, Kalhu remained a vital centre of Assyrian power, hosting the reigns of later kings who built upon Ashurnasirpal's foundations. His reliefs continued to line palace walls, his inscriptions continued to proclaim his deeds, and his innovations in administration and propaganda continued to shape Assyrian identity. In the grand narrative of the empire, Ashurnasirpal II occupies a place of singular importance, for he embodied the Neo-Assyrian revolution and gave it tangible form in stone, brick, and ritual. The founding of Nimrud was more than the creation of a city. It was the creation of a stage upon which the drama of empire could unfold. Here, in its palaces and temples, the ideology of Assyrian dominance was performed and preserved. Here, the professional army and the centralized bureaucracy found their home, and from here, the great kings of Assyria would project their power to the ends of the known world, carrying forward the legacy of Ashurnasirpal II into new conquests, new triumphs, and new challenges that would define the empire's destiny. By the mid-8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire was already a formidable force, but its foundations were not unshakable. Decades of rapid expansion under earlier kings had stretched resources thin, created political unrest, and exposed weaknesses in the state's ability to control distant provinces. Internal instability, combined with pressure from rivals, threatened to undo the achievements of Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III. It was in this context of uncertainty that Tiglath-Pileser III emerged, a ruler whose reign would not only restore Assyrian dominance, but redefine it entirely. Through sweeping military campaigns, bold reforms, and a ruthless vision of kingship, he transformed Assyria into a world empire governed with unprecedented efficiency and terror. Tiglath-Pileser III rose to power in 745 BCE, possibly seizing the throne through a coup. His accession itself was emblematic of his reign, decisive, uncompromising, and calculated to project authority. From the moment he assumed power, he launched reforms that reshaped the very structure of the Assyrian state. His military reorganization was the most immediate and consequential. The Assyrian army, already professional in nature, was expanded and diversified into a permanent standing force capable of operating year-round across vast territories. Instead of relying primarily on conscripts, Tiglath-Pileser incorporated professional soldiers, including a large contingent of cavalry that could strike swiftly and sustain campaigns in distant lands. Iron played a crucial role in this transformation. By the 8th century, the Assyrians had mastered the use of iron weaponry on a scale that gave them a decisive advantage over many rivals still dependent on bronze. Iron swords, spears, and armour equipped the Assyrian infantry, while iron fittings strengthened chariots and siege engines. The availability and durability of iron allowed the Assyrian army to equip large numbers of troops more effectively, making its campaigns both more destructive and more sustainable. This was truly an empire of iron, a military machine hardened by technology as well as organization. But Tiglath-Pileser's genius lay not only in equipping his soldiers, but in reshaping the empire they served. He reorganized the administrative system by breaking down large provinces into smaller units, reducing the power of local governors who might challenge the throne. Instead of semi-autonomous officials with broad authority, the empire was now managed by a tighter network of royal appointees directly accountable to the king. This prevented the rise of powerful local dynasties and ensured that the flow of tribute and manpower went directly to the crown. Provincial boundaries were redrawn, taxes were standardized, and the king's authority penetrated more deeply into the daily life of the empire than ever before. The policy of mass deportation, already practiced in earlier centuries, reached new heights under Tiglath-Pileser. He uprooted entire populations from conquered regions, resettling them in other parts of the empire. These deportations were carried out on a scale involving hundreds of thousands of people, fundamentally altering the demographics of the Near East. The purpose was both practical and strategic. Deportees provided labour for agriculture, construction, and military service, while their displacement weakened local identities and resistance. Cities that once defied Assyria found themselves emptied of inhabitants. Their populations dispersed across the empire to till fields, build palaces, and march in the ranks of the Assyrian army. Tiglath-Pileser's reign was marked by relentless campaigns of conquest, expanding Assyrian power farther than ever before. He subdued the kingdom of Urartu to the north, neutralizing a long-standing rival that had once threatened Assyria's heartland. To the west, he extended Assyrian control deep into Syria and the Levant, reducing wealthy city-states like Arpad and Damascus to provinces of the empire. His campaigns brought Assyrian forces into direct contact with the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, who found themselves caught between submission and destruction. The biblical record preserves echoes of these encounters, describing Assyrian kings extracting tribute and punishing rebellion with devastating force. To the south, Tiglath-Pileser intervened in Babylonian affairs, ultimately securing control over the city and even taking the title of King of Babylon himself. A remarkable achievement, for it united under one crown the two most ancient and prestigious centres of Mesopotamia. The terror he inspired was legendary. Assyrian inscriptions from his reign dwell on the punishments inflicted upon rebels, and the gruesome fates of those who defied his rule. Skins were flayed, bodies impaled, and heads stacked in heaps outside conquered cities. These acts were not mindless cruelty but deliberate theatre, designed to send a message that resistance to Assyria was not merely futile, but catastrophic. The psychological impact of this terror extended far beyond the battlefield, ensuring that many rulers submitted without a fight rather than risk annihilation. It was this calculated use of fear, coupled with military superiority and administrative control, that enabled Tiglath-Pileser to sustain such rapid expansion. In addition to his military and administrative achievements, Tiglath-Pileser cultivated an image of divine kingship that reinforced his authority. He was portrayed as the earthly agent of Ashur, chosen to impose order on chaos and extend Assyria's dominion over all lands. His inscriptions often speak in universal terms, declaring him ruler of the four quarters of the earth. This language reflected the reality of his conquests, for the empire he created stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the Zagros to the deserts of Arabia, and from the Persian Gulf to the city of Babylon. The vision of empire as universal domination, sanctioned by the gods and realized through iron and terror, reached its fullest articulation under his rule. The city of Kalhu, revitalized by Ashurnasirpal, remained the administrative and symbolic center of this empire, but under Tiglath-Pileser its role grew even more significant. Reliefs and inscriptions within its palaces proclaimed the king's victories and the submission of foreign lands. Tribute from across the empire flowed into its storehouses, while officials dispatched from Kalhu managed the far-flung provinces. The city was both the nerve center of the Assyrian machine and the stage on which its grandeur was displayed, Tiglath-Pileser's reign set new precedents that shaped the empire for the next century. His administrative reforms created a system of governance that was more centralized, efficient, and stable than any that had come before. His military reorganization gave Assyria the capacity to wage sustained campaigns across multiple fronts, making it the preeminent power of the Near East. His policies of deportation and terror left scars on the peoples of the region, but ensured that rebellion was rare and swiftly crushed. Above all, his vision of empire as a universal dominion established the ideological framework that later kings would inherit and expand upon. And yet, the very achievements that defined his reign also imposed burdens that could not easily be undone. The reliance on continuous expansion to finance the empire created a momentum that compelled later kings to follow his example, whether or not resources permitted. The vastness of the empire required constant vigilance, for rebellion was always a possibility in distant provinces. The ideology of terror, while effective in the short term, bred resentment and hatred that would later fuel coalitions against Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser had built an empire of iron, but even iron can bend and break under pressure. Nevertheless, his reign stands as one of the high points of Assyrian history. When he died in 727 BCE, he left behind an empire that was larger, stronger, and more organized than ever before. He had taken a kingdom beset by instability and transformed it into the dominant power of the ancient Near East. His reforms and conquests laid the foundation for the later reigns of Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, kings who would carry forward the legacy of expansion and terror that he had perfected. Without Tiglath-Pileser III, the Assyrian Empire as history remembers it, the first great empire of the ancient world, would not have existed. His age was one of steel nerves and iron weapons, of calculated cruelty and administrative brilliance. Through his vision, the Neo-Assyrian state became something greater than a kingdom. It became an empire in the truest sense, projecting power across continents and shaping the destiny of countless peoples. Tiglath-Pileser III stands as both the architect and the embodiment of this transformation, the king who forged Assyria's empire of iron and terror, and who left a legacy that would echo across the centuries. The death of Tiglath-Pileser III in 727 BCE left Assyria with a strong administrative system and an empire that spanned much of the Near East, but it also left behind an environment of political fragility. His successor Shalmaneser V ruled briefly, and without the commanding presence that had defined Tiglath-Pileser's reign. It was in this uncertain climate that Sargon II rose to the throne in 722 BCE, perhaps through force, perhaps through the complicated interplay of palace intrigue and military backing. Whatever the precise circumstances of his accession, his first acts as king demonstrate how precarious his legitimacy was, for Sargon's rule began under the shadow of suspicion and rebellion. Sargon's very name was a political statement. By choosing the name Sargon, echoing the legendary Sargon of Akkad, who had founded one of Mesopotamia's earliest empires, the new king cast himself in the role of a restorer and conqueror destined to establish order across the known world. The invocation of that ancient legacy was deliberate, meant to bolster his claim to the throne and connect his rule to the long continuum of Mesopotamian imperial tradition. But names alone could not secure loyalty, and from the very start Sargon had to fight to assert his authority over an empire that wavered in its allegiance. One of his first challenges came in Babylon, always the restless rival in the south. There, a Chaldean leader named Marduk-apla-iddina, known in later sources as Merodach-Baladan, had seized power and declared himself king. This challenge struck at the heart of Assyrian prestige, for control over Babylon was both a political necessity and a symbolic claim to Mesopotamian supremacy. Sargon marched against Merodach-Baladan, but the Chaldean leader proved resilient, drawing support from Elam and other southern groups who resented Assyrian domination. For years the conflict dragged on, with Babylon oscillating between submission and rebellion. Though Sargon eventually managed to assert authority over the city, Babylon remained a thorn in his side throughout his reign, a reminder that even the most powerful empire could not claim unquestioned control over the lands of the south. While the Babylonian front consumed his attention, other parts of the empire also tested his rule. In the west, the Kingdom of Israel, long a target of Assyrian campaigns, rebelled during the early years of his reign. Sargon's response was swift and devastating. In 722 BCE, he captured Samaria, the Israelite capital, after a prolonged siege. The fall of Samaria not only marked the end of the northern kingdom of Israel, but also provided a stark demonstration of Assyrian policy. Large segments of the Israelite population were deported, scattered across the empire, while foreign peoples were resettled in their place. This policy of displacement, applied with ruthless consistency, erased the independent identity of Israel and ensured that rebellion would not re-emerge easily. The biblical tradition preserved the memory of this event as a defining catastrophe, explaining the so-called lost tribes of Israel, whose fate was forever altered by Assyrian policy. Sargon's campaigns extended far beyond Israel. To the west, he defeated the powerful kingdom of Urartu, breaking its influence in Anatolia and demonstrating Assyria's superiority in a region that had long resisted domination. He also subdued the city-states of Phoenicia, securing access to the Mediterranean coast and its vital trade networks. Farther afield, his armies reached into Cyprus, bringing the island into Assyria's sphere of influence and leaving inscriptions that testified to the global reach of his ambitions. In every direction, Sargon sought to assert Assyria's supremacy, not merely through raids or temporary conquests, but by transforming regions into permanent parts of the imperial structure. Despite these successes, Sargon's reign was haunted by questions of legitimacy. Unlike kings who inherited the throne through an undisputed line, his rise to power left lingering doubts among the Assyrian elite. To secure his position, Sargon turned to monumental construction as a way of projecting authority and divine favour. It was in this context that he undertook one of the most ambitious building projects of the ancient world, the creation of a new capital city, Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon. Dur-Sharrukin, located near modern Khorsabad, was conceived as a city of dazzling scale and symbolism. From the outset, it was designed not merely as an administrative centre, but as a physical embodiment of Sargon's kingship. Its walls stretched over a mile in length, enclosing a carefully planned urban space filled with palaces, temples, and administrative buildings. The central palace, built on a massive platform, dominated the landscape, its walls adorned with reliefs that celebrated the king's victories and his divine mandate. The city was meant to be a statement to the empire and the gods alike. Sargon's reign was sanctioned, unassailable, and eternal. One of the most striking features of Dur-Sharrukin was its artistic program. The palace reliefs depicted scenes of conquest, tribute, and ceremonial procession, reinforcing the message of Assyrian dominance. Mythological creatures, such as the colossal winged bulls known as Lamassu, guarded the gateways, embodying both protection and majesty. These colossal statues, carved from stone and inscribed with dedicatory texts, were more than decoration. They were ideological guardians, proclaiming that the city itself was under divine protection and that its ruler was chosen by the gods. Visitors entering Dur-Sharrukin would have been overwhelmed by the scale and symbolism, confronted at every turn with visual reminders of the king's power. Temples within the city honoured the major deities of the Assyrian pantheon, from Ashur to Nabu and Ishtar. By incorporating these divine centres, Sargon ensured that the gods were not only honoured but made residents of his new capital. The presence of temples underscored the inseparability of political and religious authority in Assyria, while also reinforcing the claim that Sargon's rule was divinely sanctioned. Inscriptions from the site repeatedly stress his devotion and his role as the pious shepherd of the god's people, blending political propaganda with expressions of religious duty. Dur-Sharrukin was also a logistical hub, designed to manage the vast administrative machinery of empire. Storehouses, workshops, and quarters for officials ensured that the city could function as the nerve centre of Assyrian governance. The construction itself mobilized enormous resources, drawing on the labour of deported peoples and the wealth of conquered regions. In this sense, the city was not only a symbol of empire but a product of it, built from the manpower and tribute extracted from Assyria's far-flung dominions. Yet the grandeur of Dur-Sharrukin was matched by its fragility. Despite the immense effort poured into its creation, the city was only briefly occupied. In 705 BCE, as Sargon campaigned in Anatolia against rebellious tribes, he was killed in battle under mysterious circumstances. His body was never recovered, a shocking end that carried ominous implications in Mesopotamian belief, where the proper burial of a king was considered essential for the continuity of divine favour. His death in this manner was viewed as a calamity, a sign of divine disapproval that cast a shadow over his legacy. In the wake of his death, his son Sennacherib abandoned Dur-Sharrukin and established a new capital at Nineveh. The city that had been intended as the eternal monument of Sargon's reign was left unfinished, a haunting testament to the precariousness of power. For archaeologists, Dur-Sharrukin has provided invaluable insight into Assyrian art, architecture and ideology, for its ruins, buried and preserved, contain some of the most spectacular reliefs and artifacts of the Neo-Assyrian period. But for Sargon himself, the city became a tragic symbol of ambition cut short, its splendour overshadowed by the violent end of its founder. Sargon II remains a paradoxical figure in Assyrian history. On one hand, his reign was marked by extraordinary military and administrative achievements, extending Assyrian influence across a vast territory and consolidating its empire in ways that would endure for decades. On the other hand, his questionable legitimacy and his ignominious death undermined the very message of permanence and divine favour that he had sought to project. His city, Dur-Sharrukin, stands as both a monument to his vision and a reminder of the fragility of human ambition in the face of fortune and fate. Nevertheless, his reign represents a vital chapter in the story of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Sargon embodied the qualities of ruthlessness, ambition, and vision that defined Assyrian kingship, while his building of Dur-Sharrukin illustrates the central role of monumental architecture in legitimizing rule. Though his death cast a shadow, the administrative and territorial framework he established ensured that Assyria remained the dominant power of the Near East, ready to be carried forward by his successors into new conquests and new triumphs. When Sargontes fell in battle in 705 BCE, the empire that he had worked so tirelessly to consolidate was left shaken. His sudden death and the abandonment of Dur-Sharrukin left Assyria without the certainty and continuity that a well-prepared succession might have provided. Into this moment of vulnerability stepped his son, Sennacherib, who inherited not only the throne but also the daunting task of proving that the empire's supremacy had not been weakened by his father's fate. Sennacherib rose to this challenge with a combination of ruthlessness, vision, and relentless energy, forging a reign that remains one of the most vividly remembered in ancient history. From the outset, Sennacherib faced unrest across the empire. In Babylonia, the ever-restless southern region, Merodach-Baladan re-emerged from obscurity to reclaim the throne, once again challenging Assyrian authority. His return was a clear test of Sennacherib's legitimacy, for Babylon had long been both rival and prize, a city whose symbolic weight was matched only by its propensity for rebellion. Sennacherib launched campaigns to drive Merodach-Baladan from power, eventually defeating him, but Babylon itself remained a recurring source of conflict throughout his reign. Indeed, his dealings with the city would ultimately culminate in one of the most controversial and shocking acts of his career. To the west, the Levant became another theatre of rebellion. The small but wealthy states of the region had never accepted Assyrian domination without resentment, and in the wake of Sargon's death, many saw an opportunity to assert independence. Among them was Hezekiah, king of Judah, who allied himself with other states in an anti-Assyrian coalition, supported by Egypt. For Hezekiah and his allies, the gamble was clear. If they could resist long enough, Egypt might provide the backing needed to drive out the Assyrians. For Sennacherib, such defiance was intolerable, for rebellion in the west threatened not only tribute revenues, but also the prestige of Assyria's power. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib launched a major campaign into the Levant to crush the rebellion. His annals describe the campaign in vivid detail, listing the cities he captured and the tribute he exacted. According to Assyrian records, he subdued 46 fortified cities of Judah, deported vast numbers of their inhabitants, and surrounded Jerusalem itself, trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. The image is one of overwhelming power, meant to emphasize the futility of resistance. Reliefs from Sennacherib's palace later depicted the siege of Lachish, one of Judah's key cities, showing battering rams, archers, and the deportation of captives in scenes that combine artistry with ruthless propaganda. The fall of Lachish was celebrated as a major victory, its conquest immortalized in stone as a warning to others who might defy Assyria. Yet the siege of Jerusalem, though remembered as a crowning triumph in Assyrian inscriptions, took on a different meaning in the biblical tradition. The Hebrew Bible recounts how Sennacherib's army surrounded the city, but was struck by divine intervention, an angel of the Lord who destroyed vast numbers of Assyrian soldiers in a single night, forcing the king to withdraw. The Assyrian records, unsurprisingly, make no mention of such a disaster. Instead, they present the campaign as a victory, highlighting the tribute that Hezekiah paid to secure his survival. The truth of what happened remains debated. Perhaps Jerusalem was spared because it was not strategically vital. Perhaps disease struck the Assyrian camp, or perhaps Hezekiah's surrender was sufficient to satisfy Sennacherib's aims. Whatever the precise details, the contrasting accounts illustrate how the same event could be remembered as both triumph and humiliation, depending on the perspective of the storytellers. The campaign against Judah cemented Sennacherib's reputation as a ruthless and relentless conqueror. His use of deportation continued on a massive scale, uprooting populations and redistributing them across the empire. His annals are filled with boasts of the tributes he extracted, the cities he burned, and the punishments inflicted on rebels. His reliance on fear as an instrument of policy was in keeping with Assyrian tradition, but under his reign it was given even greater prominence, a reminder that terror was as much a tool of empire as iron and chariots. Yet Sennacherib's legacy was not defined by warfare alone. He was also a builder of extraordinary vision, responsible for one of the greatest transformations in Assyrian urban history. Dissatisfied with the brief and ill-fated capital at Dur-Sharrukin, he shifted the royal seat to Nineveh, transforming it into a city of unprecedented grandeur. Under his direction, Nineveh became not merely a political capital, but a showcase of imperial power, a city that would later inspire the awe of generations. The scale of his construction at Nineveh was immense. He expanded the city's walls to enclose an area nearly 8 miles in circumference, far larger than most ancient capitals. Within these walls, he built palaces, temples, and gardens, all supplied by an elaborate system of canals and aqueducts that brought water from distant mountains. Among his most famous achievements was the creation of a massive palace that he called the Palace Without Rival. Its walls were adorned with reliefs depicting his campaigns, his victories, and scenes of tribute, transforming the palace into a living chronicle of Assyrian supremacy. Visitors walking through its halls would have been overwhelmed by the scale and the artistry, each scene reinforcing the image of the king as master of the world. Sennacherib also undertook ambitious hydraulic projects, building canals and aqueducts that supplied Nineveh with abundant water. These works were feats of engineering as well as symbols of royal authority, for they demonstrated the king's ability to harness nature itself for the benefit of his city. Later traditions would remember Nineveh as a city of wonders, with gardens that some scholars have linked to the legendary hanging gardens described by classical authors. Whether or not the hanging gardens were truly located there, it is clear that Sennacherib's Nineveh was a place of extraordinary beauty and abundance, made possible by his vision and ambition. His relationship with Babylon, however, reveals the darker side of his reign. Throughout his rule, Babylon remained a centre of resistance, rallying opposition to Assyria's authority. Sennacherib campaigned repeatedly in the south, but Babylonian rebellion, often supported by Elam, persisted. In 689 BCE, after years of frustration, he resolved to put an end to the problem once and for all. In an unprecedented act, he destroyed Babylon itself, flooding the city with waters from the Euphrates, tearing down its temples and scattering its population. For Assyria, this was a shocking decision, for Babylon was not only a political rival, but also a city of immense cultural and religious significance. To annihilate it was to break with centuries of tradition, defying the notion that Assyrian kings should protect Babylon as a sacred counterpart to their own power. Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon was remembered with horror by many contemporaries, and later Assyrian kings would seek to distance themselves from the act by rebuilding the city. But for Sennacherib, the destruction was an assertion of absolute authority, a declaration that even the most venerable city of Mesopotamia could not defy him without consequence. It was an act of terror and symbolism, meant to silence rebellion through fear, yet it also tarnished his reputation and left a legacy of controversy that endured long after his death. The end of Sennacherib's reign was marked by both triumph and tragedy. He had expanded Assyria's power, crushed its enemies, and built Nineveh into a city of unrivaled magnificence. But in 681 BCE, he was assassinated, likely by his own sons, in a palace coup that revealed the fragility of even the most powerful throne. His death echoed the violent fate of many Assyrian kings, a reminder that the empire he ruled was as turbulent within as it was relentless without. His successor, Esarhaddon, would inherit both the splendour of Nineveh and the challenges of maintaining control over a vast and restless empire. Sennacherib's legacy is a tapestry of contradictions. He was the builder of Nineveh and the destroyer of Babylon, the besieger of Jerusalem and the engineer of canals, a king whose vision shaped the greatest city of the ancient Near East, but whose ruthlessness left scars that history never forgot. His reign embodies the dual nature of the Assyrian Empire itself, an empire of brilliance and brutality, of creation and destruction, of wonder and terror. Through his campaigns and his building projects, he left an imprint so vivid that his name echoes in biblical texts, archaeological remains, and the annals of his own scribes. He was one of Assyria's greatest kings and also one of its most infamous. By the time Nineveh emerged as the heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire under Sennacherib, it had already existed for centuries as a city of regional importance. But under his reign, and continued by his successors, it was transformed into something unprecedented, a metropolis that became synonymous with Assyrian power, a showcase of architectural ambition, artistic brilliance, and imperial ideology. If earlier kings had used capitals like Kalhu or Dur-Sharrukin to announce the might of Assyria, Nineveh became the culmination of these experiments, a city so vast, so elaborately adorned, and so strategically presented that it stood as both a physical and symbolic expression of empire itself. Sennacherib's decision to make Nineveh the capital was not arbitrary. The city's location on the Tigris provided access to trade routes, fertile lands, and defensive advantages. More importantly, the abandonment of Dur-Sharrukin after his father's death left him with the need to create a new seat of power that would both eclipse past attempts and serve as a stage for his own vision of kingship. Nineveh was chosen to be not merely a functional capital, but a city without rival, one whose splendour would proclaim Assyria's dominance to its inhabitants, its subjects, and its enemies alike. The most visible transformation of Nineveh came in its sheer scale. Sennacherib expanded the city's walls to enclose an area that dwarfed most ancient capitals, with a circumference of nearly 8 miles and walls rising so high and thick that they projected impregnability. Within these walls lay palaces, temples, gardens, and administrative complexes that together created an urban landscape of staggering ambition. The walls themselves were not only defences but statements, punctuated by monumental gates adorned with inscriptions and reliefs that proclaimed the authority of the king. Each entrance into the city was thus a passage into the ideology of empire, guarded by colossal lamassu figures, those human-headed winged bulls carved from stone that symbolised both divine protection and kingly power. At the heart of Nineveh stood the palace without rival, Sennacherib's masterpiece. This palace was more than a royal residence. It was a theatre of power. Its walls were lined with reliefs that depicted the king's victories in war, the subjugation of enemies, and the tribute brought from distant lands. Among the most famous are the scenes from the conquest of Lachish, vividly illustrating the Assyrian war machine in action. Siege towers rolling against walls, battering rams pounding gates, defenders hurling missiles, and captives being led away into exile. These reliefs, carved in exquisite detail, were not intended as neutral records of history but as carefully curated propaganda. Every visitor to the palace, whether an Assyrian official or a foreign envoy, would be confronted by these images, reminded of the king's power and the futility of resistance. The artistry of Nineveh's reliefs reveals the sophistication of Assyrian visual culture. Scenes were carved with attention to narrative detail, conveying not only military triumphs, but also moments of ceremony, hunting, and ritual. Lion hunt reliefs, for instance, portrayed the king slaying lions in controlled arenas, a symbolic act representing the monarch's mastery over chaos and nature. The lions were depicted with astonishing realism, their muscles tensed, their agony palpable, their deaths dramatizing the absolute control of the king. In this way, art functioned as both aesthetic achievement and ideological statement, merging naturalistic observation with symbolic purpose. Beyond the palaces, Nineveh was adorned with temples dedicated to the gods of Assyria. These sanctuaries reinforced the divine sanction of the empire, for Assyrian kingship was always presented as a partnership with the gods, especially Ashur, who was seen as the true sovereign of the realm. Temples to Ishtar, Nabu, and other deities further tied the city to the broader religious landscape of Mesopotamia. By placing these sacred centres within the capital, the king made Nineveh not only the political, but also the spiritual heart of the empire. One of Sennacherib's most remarkable achievements was his hydraulic engineering. He undertook the construction of canals, aqueducts, and irrigation systems that brought water from distant mountains to supply the city. Among the most impressive was the aqueduct at Jerwan, built of massive stone blocks and inscribed with texts celebrating the king's achievement. These works ensured a steady supply of water for drinking, agriculture, and gardens, transforming Nineveh into a city of abundance. Watercourses ran through the urban fabric, feeding not only the needs of the population but also the luxurious gardens that became a hallmark of the city's splendour. It is within this context that traditions of the hanging gardens emerge. While classical authors later attributed them to Babylon, some modern scholars have suggested that the descriptions may fit more closely with Nineveh under Sennacherib. His inscriptions describe the planting of exotic trees and plants brought from across the empire and the creation of terraced gardens watered by his canals. These gardens would have been marvels of both engineering and aesthetics, a living symbol of the empire's reach, for they gathered flora from distant lands and displayed them in the king's capital. Whether or not these were the gardens later remembered by Greek and Roman writers, they testify to Sennacherib's vision of a city that embodied the wealth and diversity of Assyria. The propaganda of Nineveh extended beyond stone and water. Inscriptions, carved on monuments and written on clay tablets, proclaim the king's victories and the blessings of the gods. These texts emphasize the inevitability of Assyrian dominance, portraying rebellion as both futile and impious. The combination of reliefs, inscriptions, and monumental architecture created a total environment of propaganda, where every aspect of the city reinforced the image of the king as invincible, divinely chosen, and universally feared. To walk through Nineveh was to walk through a narrative of conquest and power, carefully constructed to leave no doubt as to who ruled the world. Nineveh's splendour did not vanish with the death of Sennacherib. His successors, Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, continued to expand and embellish the city. Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon after its destruction, seeking to heal the wounds left by his father's act, but he also invested heavily in Nineveh, ensuring its place as the imperial capital. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, made Nineveh famous for its library, a collection of thousands of tablets that preserved the literature, science, and history of Mesopotamia. Through this accumulation of knowledge, Nineveh became not only a centre of political power, but also of cultural preservation, a place where the intellectual heritage of the ancient Near East was gathered and safeguarded. By the height of its glory, Nineveh was the largest city in the world, a metropolis of perhaps 120,000 people, surrounded by walls filled with palaces, gardens, and temples, and sustained by the tribute of an empire that stretched from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean. Its size and wealth astonished later visitors, and its memory endured long after its fall. To its inhabitants, Nineveh was the embodiment of Assyria. To its enemies, it was the symbol of arrogance and oppression. To history, it stands as one of the greatest cities of antiquity. The splendour of Nineveh was not an accident, but the deliberate creation of kings who understood that power was not only exercised through armies and laws, but also through spectacle and ideology. By filling the city with art, gardens, and propaganda, they ensured that the empire's authority was constantly reaffirmed in the minds of those who lived within its walls and those who came to its gates. The grandeur of Nineveh was both a reflection of Assyria's power and a tool for sustaining it, for the city itself proclaimed the message that the empire was eternal, irresistible, and divinely ordained. And yet, as later events would show, no city, however magnificent, could escape the vulnerabilities of empire. Nineveh's splendour would one day be matched by its destruction, its gardens withered, its palaces burned, its reliefs buried beneath rubble. But in the centuries of its glory it stood as the unrivaled jewel of Assyria, a city where art, engineering and propaganda converged to create a vision of empire unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. When Ashurbanipal came to the throne in 669 BCE, he inherited an empire that had already reached extraordinary heights under his father Esarhaddon and his grandfather Sennacherib. Assyria's dominance extended across the Near East, and Nineveh was the unrivaled capital of the ancient world. Ashurbanipal himself was not only a warrior king in the traditional Assyrian mould, but also a ruler whose interests extended far beyond conquest and construction. He was one of the few Mesopotamian monarchs to openly boast of his literacy, declaring in inscriptions that he could read and write the cuneiform script, understand obscure Sumerian, and consult the texts of ancient times. For a king to present himself as a scholar was unusual, but in Ashurbanipal's case it was no empty claim. His reign gave rise to the greatest royal library of the ancient world, a collection that would preserve the intellectual traditions of Mesopotamia for millennia to come. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh was not a single building, but a collection of archives housed across several locations within the capital, including his palace and temples such as that of Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing. Over 30,000 clay tablets have been recovered from these sites, containing texts that cover the full range of Mesopotamian knowledge. The scale of the collection was unprecedented, and its significance lies not only in its size but also in the deliberate effort to gather and preserve the texts of earlier ages. The library included works of literature, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, whose fragments found in Nineveh allow modern readers to reconstruct one of humanity's earliest masterpieces of storytelling. Religious hymns, myths, and prayers were carefully copied, ensuring that the voices of ancient Sumerian and Babylonian traditions were not lost. Historical annals, royal inscriptions, and chronicles provided records of past kings and empires, creating a sense of continuity that linked Ashurbanipal's reign to the deep history of Mesopotamia. Legal texts, treaties, and administrative documents reflected the practical workings of governance, while astronomical records, omen texts, and medical treatises revealed the scientific and divinatory practices that guided decision-making in the ancient world. What makes the library so remarkable is the conscious effort to preserve knowledge from across the Mesopotamian cultural horizon. Ashurbanipal ordered the collection of texts from cities like Babylon, Uruk, and Nippur, directing scribes to copy or confiscate materials to be brought back to Nineveh. In this way, his library became not only a repository of Assyrian writings, but also an archive of the entire Mesopotamian tradition. The king's inscriptions describe how he took pride in gathering the wisdom of the ages, presenting himself as a ruler uniquely equipped to understand and safeguard the intellectual heritage of his civilization. The organization of the library reveals a systematic approach. Many tablets were arranged according to subject, with colophons identifying their contents and sometimes including warnings against misuse. Some tablets were copies of older works, carefully inscribed by scribes to ensure accuracy. Others contained annotations or glossaries, helping readers understand archaic or obscure terms. This suggests that the library was not only a symbolic collection, but also a functional one, used by scribes, scholars, and priests in the service of the king and the empire. Among the texts preserved were the great omen series that guided royal decision-making, such as Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compilation of astronomical omens that link the movements of the heavens to the fates of kings and kingdoms. Medical texts offered diagnoses and treatments for diseases, blending empirical observation with ritual incantations. Lexical lists, which recorded vocabularies and translations between Sumerian and Akkadian, reveal the scholarly efforts to preserve and understand languages long obsolete. Ritual instructions, temple hymns, and incantations reflect the central role of religion in public and private life, while myths and epics provide glimpses into the imagination and values of ancient Mesopotamian society. The significance of Ashurbanipal's library cannot be overstated. Without it, much of Mesopotamian literature and science would have been lost forever. The very fact that we know the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of heroism, mortality, and the search for meaning, is due to the survival of tablets from Nineveh. The same is true for countless myths, hymns, and historical texts that form the foundation of our understanding of the ancient Near East. In a sense, Ashurbanipal's ambition to gather and preserve knowledge succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. For though Nineveh would one day fall in flames, the clay tablets endured, buried beneath rubble until they were rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. Ashurbanipal's embrace of scholarship did not mean that he neglected the martial traditions of Assyrian kingship. On the contrary, he was a formidable warrior who led campaigns against Elam, Egypt, and rebellious vassals. His reliefs depict scenes of conquest and brutality that rival those of his predecessors, including gruesome depictions of captured enemies being flayed, decapitated, or paraded in humiliation. One of the most famous series of reliefs from his reign depicts the lion hunt, where Ashurbanipal is shown killing lions with bow and spear in a highly choreographed display of dominance. Just as his library proclaimed his mastery of knowledge, these reliefs proclaimed his mastery over chaos and nature, reaffirming his role as the supreme protector of order. In this way, Ashurbanipal combined two aspects of kingship that rarely coexisted so visibly: the scholar and the warrior. He presented himself as both a man of letters and a man of action, embodying the ideal that true kingship required mastery over both the intellectual and the physical realms. His inscriptions reveal pride not only in his ability to read and write, but also in his skill at commanding armies and crushing foes. For Ashurbanipal, these were not contradictory roles, but complementary ones. each reinforcing the image of a king whose authority extended into every sphere of life. The propaganda value of the library should not be overlooked. By gathering the texts of Mesopotamia into Nineveh, Ashurbanipal was also asserting Assyria's cultural supremacy. Just as conquered peoples were deported to strengthen the empire, so too was their intellectual heritage absorbed into the Assyrian capital. The library thus served as both archive and statement, a declaration that Assyria was not only the master of lands and peoples, but also the guardian of civilization itself. This was a powerful message, one that placed Ashurbanipal at the centre of history, the inheritor and preserver of all that had come before. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE brought an end to Ashurbanipal's empire, but the clay tablets of his library survived the destruction, preserved by the very fires that consumed the city. When they were unearthed in the 19th century, they opened a window into a world long forgotten, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct the languages, literature and science of Mesopotamia. The knowledge that Ashurbanipal had sought to gather and preserve for his own purposes thus transcended the fall of his empire, shaping our understanding of antiquity in ways that he could never have imagined. Ashurbanipal's library stands as a testament to the paradox of Assyrian power. Built in the midst of conquest and terror, it nevertheless safeguarded the intellectual achievements of Mesopotamia, ensuring that they would outlast the empire that had gathered them. In Ashurbanipal, the image of the king as warrior and scholar reached its fullest expression, leaving a legacy that was both brutal and enduring. His reign represents not only the climax of Assyrian greatness, but also the preservation of the wisdom of ages, a gift to history that has survived long after the palaces and walls of Nineveh crumbled into dust. The reign of Ashurbanipal marked the height of Assyrian power, but it also contained the seeds of its decline. The empire he ruled stretched farther than any previous Assyrian monarch had ever commanded, its armies victorious across the Near East, its capital the unrivaled jewel of the ancient world. Yet beneath the splendour of Nineveh and the triumphs carved in stone reliefs, the foundations of the empire were beginning to erode. When Ashurbanipal died around 631 BCE, he left behind not only a vast dominion, but also a fragile political landscape strained by the costs of perpetual warfare, the resentment of conquered peoples, and the internal rivalries of the Assyrian ruling elite. The succession after Ashurbanipal is murky, a sign in itself of the instability that followed. His son or designated heir, Ashur-etil-ilani, reigned briefly, but was soon overshadowed by competing factions within the royal family and the military. Another ruler, Sinsharishkun, eventually claimed the throne, but by this time Assyria's enemies were gathering strength, emboldened by the perception that the empire was vulnerable. Civil war erupted between rival claimants, draining the strength of an empire that had once projected an aura of unshakable unity. As Assyria faltered internally, external pressures mounted. In the south, Babylonia once again became a rallying point for rebellion. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain who rose to power in Babylon in 626 BCE, the Babylonians threw off Assyrian domination and began carving out their independence. Unlike earlier revolts that had been crushed by Assyrian force, this rebellion endured, for Nabopolassar proved a capable leader who could unite the fractious peoples of Babylonia under a common cause. He not only secured Babylon's freedom, but also positioned it as the nucleus of a new rising power, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. To the east, the Medes, an Iranian people who had long dwelled in the Zagros Mountains, also began to consolidate their strength. Under King Kyaxares, they transformed from a tribal confederation into a formidable kingdom. The Medes had suffered under Assyrian campaigns in the past, but now, with Assyria weakened, they saw an opportunity for revenge and expansion. Alliances were forged between Babylonians and Medes, a coalition born of shared hatred for Assyria and the recognition that only together could they topple the great empire. The years that followed were marked by relentless conflict. Nabopolassar's forces pushed northward, capturing Assyrian strongholds in the south and threatening the heartland. Assyria fought back desperately, with Sin-shar-ishkun and his armies attempting to hold the line. But each campaign stretched resources thinner and exposed the growing weakness of the empire. The Medes joined the struggle around 614 BCE, launching assaults into Assyrian territory and dealing devastating blows to cities like Ashur, the ancient religious centre of the Assyrian state. Its fall was not only a strategic loss, but also a symbolic one, striking at the very identity of Assyria as a people. The coalition of Babylonians and Medes proved overwhelming. Unlike earlier foes, they coordinated their attacks and sustained their pressure, forcing Assyria into a defensive war on multiple fronts. The Assyrian military, once the most formidable in the world, was still capable of ferocious resistance, but the empire's ability to replenish its forces had been eroded by decades of constant campaigning. Subject peoples who had long been forced to send tribute and troops now seized the opportunity to defect, weakening the imperial core. The aura of inevitability that had surrounded Assyrian power was shattered, replaced by the realization that the empire could be defeated. By 612 BCE, the coalition marched directly against Nineveh itself. The great capital, which had stood as a symbol of Assyrian dominance for nearly a century, was now the target of destruction. The siege that followed was brutal and unrelenting. Ancient sources, including the Babylonian Chronicle and later traditions recorded by Greek historians, describe how the combined forces of Babylonians and Medes encircled the city, cutting it off and battering its defences. For 3 months, Nineveh resisted, its massive walls and fortifications holding back the attackers, while within the city the population endured the horrors of siege, hunger, disease, and the constant fear of collapse. Eventually the coalition breached the defences. Accounts suggest that flooding from the nearby Tigris River may have played a role, either through natural disaster or deliberate engineering, weakening the walls and allowing attackers to pour into the city. What followed was slaughter and devastation. The palaces that had once housed the treasures of the empire were looted and burned, the temples desecrated, the reliefs smashed or buried under rubble. Nineveh, the city that Sennacherib had transformed into a palace without rival, the city whose gardens had once amazed visitors, was consumed in fire and ruin. Its fall was so complete that centuries later, travellers would struggle to believe that such a great metropolis had ever existed, its remains buried under earth and forgotten by time. The destruction of Nineveh marked not only the end of a city, but the collapse of an empire. With the capital in ruins and the royal family either slain or scattered, Assyria ceased to exist as an independent power. Remnants of Assyrian forces continued to resist in Harran and Carchemish for a few years, allied with Egypt in a desperate attempt to hold on to some fragment of the empire, but these efforts ultimately failed. By 609 BCE, with the defeat at Harran, Assyria as a political entity was extinguished. The empire that had once dominated the Near East with iron discipline and relentless conquest vanished from the stage of history. The memory of Assyria's fall resonated powerfully in the ancient world. For those who had suffered under its conquests, the destruction of Nineveh was seen as divine retribution, the punishment of an arrogant empire by the gods. Biblical texts celebrated the downfall of Assyria as the vindication of prophecy, portraying Nineveh's ruin as the just reward for its cruelty and violence. Greek historians later retold the story with fascination, marvelling at how a power so vast could be brought so low. The image of Nineveh's burning became a lasting symbol of imperial hubris and inevitable downfall. Yet even in destruction, Assyria's influence did not disappear. The Babylonians and Medes inherited much from the empire they had destroyed, adopting aspects of its administrative system, military practices and cultural traditions. The memory of Assyrian kings, their campaigns and their cities lived on in inscriptions, ruins and stories passed down through the ages. The empire's legacy endured, even as its heartland lay in ruins. For modern archaeology, The burning of Nineveh proved to be a paradoxical blessing. The fires that consumed the city baked many of Ashurbanipal's clay tablets, preserving them for millennia until their rediscovery in the 19th century. Thus, while the palaces and gardens perished, the knowledge gathered in the royal library survived, allowing us today to read the words of ancient scribes and to reconstruct the history and mythology of Mesopotamia. In this way, the fall of Nineveh both destroyed and preserved, erasing the empire yet safeguarding its memory. The collapse of Assyria remains one of the most dramatic examples of imperial downfall in history. Within a span of just a few decades, the empire moved from unrivaled dominance to utter extinction, undone by internal strife, external enemies, and the sheer weight of maintaining a system built on conquest and fear. Its rise and fall demonstrate the cyclical nature of power in the ancient world, where no empire, however mighty, could escape the forces of change and resistance. Nineveh's ashes remind us that even the greatest cities are fragile, and that the monuments of human ambition can be swept away in a single generation. The destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE marked the violent end of Assyria as a state, but it did not erase the people, the culture, or the enduring impact of their empire. The Babylonians and Medes who divided Assyrian territory inherited not only its lands but also many of its institutions, practices, and traditions. In this sense, the afterlife of Assyria was as significant as its history, for the ideas and structures developed under its kings continued to shape the ancient world long after its armies had been defeated and its capital burned. The immediate successor to Assyria's dominance was Babylonia under the Chaldean dynasty, often called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabopolassar, who had led the revolt that toppled Assyria, established this new dynasty, and his son Nebuchadnezzar thus would bring it to its peak. The Babylonians inherited many of the Assyrian administrative techniques that had allowed such a vast empire to function. Provincial governance, tribute systems, and the use of deportation to control populations all continued under Babylonian rule. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar's deportation of the people of Judah, including the famous exile to Babylon described in the Hebrew Bible, was directly modelled on earlier Assyrian practices. What Assyria had pioneered as a means of maintaining control over subject peoples became a standard tool of imperial management. In architecture and urban planning too, the Babylonians drew inspiration from Assyrian precedents. Babylon itself was rebuilt and expanded into a magnificent city, famous for its massive walls, grand temples, and monumental gates such as the Ishtar Gate, which still astonishes visitors to this day. While distinctly Babylonian in style and symbolism, the city's grandeur reflected the Assyrian model of capitals as showcases of imperial might. Just as Nineveh had served as a theatre of power for the Assyrians, so too did Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar proclaim the strength and wealth of the new empire. Culturally, however, the Babylonians presented themselves as restorers of Mesopotamian tradition rather than innovators. They emphasized continuity with the ancient heritage of Sumer and Akkad, downplaying their debt to Assyria while quietly adopting many of its methods. This selective memory was important, for while Assyria had been feared as a brutal oppressor, Babylon sought to present itself as a legitimate heir to Mesopotamian civilization. Yet beneath this cultural veneer lay the undeniable fact that much of the machinery of Babylonian imperial rule was Assyrian in origin. When the Persians under Cyrus the Great swept into Mesopotamia in 539 BCE, they too absorbed and adapted elements of the Assyrian legacy. The Achaemenid Empire, which would stretch from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, relied on administrative practices that bore striking resemblance to those of Assyria. The division of the empire into satrapies, or provinces, each overseen by a governor responsible to the king, echoed the Assyrian system of provincial governors and vassal kings. The Persians also inherited the practice of road networks and communication systems, ensuring that orders could travel swiftly across the empire. The royal road of the Persians has often been celebrated as an achievement, but its roots can be traced to the logistical innovations of Assyrian governance and warfare. The use of deportation and population transfers likewise continued under Persian rule, though with a somewhat softer edge. Cyrus's famous decree allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands has often been contrasted with the harsh policies of the Assyrians, yet the very fact that deportation was such a widespread practice reveals how deeply ingrained it had become in the imperial toolkit. The Persians, like the Babylonians before them, inherited a world shaped by Assyria, and even when they sought to present themselves as benevolent rulers, they were operating within frameworks that Assyria had first established. In the realm of art and monumental display, the Persians also drew on Assyrian precedents. The reliefs at Persepolis, with their processions of tribute-bearers and depictions of the king as supreme ruler, echo the imagery that had once adorned the palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud. The colossal scale of Persian capitals, designed to awe visitors and proclaim the majesty of the empire, was part of a tradition pioneered by the Assyrians. Yet the Persians infused this model with their own style and symbolism, blending influences from across their vast dominion into a uniquely Persian synthesis. The Greeks too encountered the Assyrian legacy, though often indirectly. By the time Greek historians such as Herodotus and later Xenophon wrote about the East, Assyria itself had long since fallen. Yet stories of Nineveh's grandeur and destruction circulated widely, shaping Greek conceptions of the ancient Near East. Herodotus speaks of the wealth and size of Babylon, which he may have understood as a successor to Assyria's cities, while Xenophon's account of the ruins he encountered during the retreat of the 10,000 in the early 4th century BCE has often been interpreted as references to the remains of Assyrian cities. To the Greeks, Assyria became part of the broader tapestry of barbarian empires, vast and exotic realms of wealth, cruelty and splendour. In literature and memory, Assyria occupied a paradoxical role. On the one hand, it was remembered as the archetype of tyranny and brutality. Biblical texts in particular portray Assyria as an oppressor, its kings arrogant and violent, its destruction a divine judgment. On the other hand, the material achievements of Assyria, their cities, their art, their administrative innovations, continued to shape the empires that followed. Thus, even as Assyria was denounced as a warning against hubris, its legacy lived on in the very structures of power that defined the ancient world. For the people who had once called themselves Assyrians, the fall of the empire did not mean extinction. Communities of Assyrian descent continued to inhabit northern Mesopotamia, adapting to new rulers while maintaining aspects of their identity. Inscriptions and archaeological remains suggest continuity in local traditions, even as political control shifted from Babylonians to Persians to Greeks. The afterlife of Assyria was not only a matter of imperial inheritance, but also of cultural survival among the people themselves, whose presence in the region endured through centuries of foreign domination. When Alexander the Great swept through the Near East in the late 4th century BCE, he too encountered the remnants of Assyrian greatness. The ruins of Nineveh and other cities, though already ancient, were still visible, silent witnesses to a past empire. Alexander's successors, the Seleucids, established new cities in Mesopotamia, blending Hellenistic culture with local traditions. While they did not explicitly revive Assyrian identity, the memory of the region's past remained a backdrop to their rule. The Greeks admired the monumental scale of Mesopotamian ruins, even as they overlaid them with their own cultural forms. Thus, from Babylonians to Persians to Greeks, the shadow of Assyria persisted. Its methods of rule, its artistic conventions, and its cultural memory shaped the empires that followed, ensuring that even in death, Assyria remained a force in the ancient world. The afterlife of Assyria is a story of continuity and transformation, where the achievements of a fallen empire became the foundations for new powers, and where the memory of its rise and fall served as both inspiration and caution. The story of Assyria did not end with the burning of Nineveh. It was carried forward in the laws and armies of Babylon, in the palaces and provinces of Persia, in the histories and imaginations of the Greeks. In this way, the Assyrian legacy endured long after the empire itself had vanished, a reminder that the influence of a civilization is not measured only by the length of its political life, but by the depth of its imprint on those who come after. When Nineveh burned in 612 BCE and the Assyrian Empire collapsed under the weight of rebellion and invasion, it seemed as though Assyria itself had been erased from history. Cities were reduced to rubble, palaces looted and set aflame, and the name of Assyria, once synonymous with power, terror and grandeur, faded from political maps. Yet as with so many fallen civilizations, its memory did not vanish entirely. Instead, it lingered in fragments, through biblical writings that condemned its cruelty, through Greek accounts that marvelled at its wealth and arrogance, and through the endurance of its people who continued to live in northern Mesopotamia under new rulers. Over centuries, the Assyrian legacy took on new forms, oscillating between vilification, forgetfulness, rediscovery, and ultimately modern revival. For much of antiquity, Assyria's ruins remained visible but unrecognized. The colossal mounds along the Tigris, such as those at Kuyunjik, Nimrud, and Khorsabad, stood as silent witnesses to the empire's vanished glory. Travellers and conquerors who passed through the region often remarked on these mysterious heaps of earth and stone, but their connection to the great cities of Assyria was not always clear. Local populations preserved legends about ancient kings and destroyed palaces, but to the wider world the Assyrians became a shadowy presence, known more from hostile accounts than from their own voices. In biblical tradition, Assyria lived on as the archetype of arrogance and oppression. Prophets spoke of Nineveh as the bloody city, doomed for its violence and hubris. The story of Jonah, reluctant prophet to the Assyrians, painted Nineveh as a place both wicked and yet capable of repentance. These narratives ensured that Assyria's memory persisted in Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic thought, though often as a cautionary tale rather than a celebration. To the biblical imagination, Assyria symbolized the dangers of imperial pride and the certainty of divine judgment. Greek and Roman authors likewise contributed to shaping Assyria's legacy, though often through a lens of fascination and exaggeration. Writers such as Herodotus, Ctesias, and later Diodorus Siculus preserved stories of Assyrian kings and queens, particularly the semi-legendary Semiramis, whom they portrayed as a warrior queen and builder of monuments. These accounts blended fact with myth, creating a picture of Assyria as both formidable and decadent. By the time of the Roman Empire, Nineveh was already long gone, yet the name still evoked images of lost grandeur and imperial excess. For the people living in northern Mesopotamia, however, the end of the empire did not mean the end of Assyrian identity. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests continuity of population and culture in the Assyrian heartland. Villages, towns, and even some cities remained inhabited, their residents adapting to new rulers while maintaining elements of language, religion, and tradition. Over centuries, Assyrian communities absorbed influences from Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and eventually Arabs and Turks, yet many retained a sense of distinctiveness rooted in their ancient heritage. Christianity, which spread through the region in the early centuries of the Common Era, became a defining marker of identity for many Assyrians, and the Syriac language, a descendant of Aramaic, served as both liturgical and communal tongue. In this way, the Assyrian people outlived their empire, even as their history was reshaped by outsiders. The rediscovery of Assyria in the modern era marked a turning point in how its legacy was understood. In the mid-19th century, European archaeologists began excavating the great mounds of Mesopotamia, uncovering the ruins of cities that had lain buried for over 2 millennia. At Nimrud, Austin Henry Layard unearthed colossal statues, palace reliefs, and inscriptions that brought the Assyrians vividly back into view. At Nineveh, the remains of Sennacherib's palace and Ashurbanipal's library were uncovered, revealing thousands of cuneiform tablets that transformed the study of the ancient Near East. For the first time, Assyria's own words and art could be read and studied, allowing scholars to piece together a history that had previously been filtered only through hostile or fragmentary sources. The impact of these discoveries was immense. In Europe, the unveiling of Assyrian art and architecture captured the public imagination. Museums displayed colossal Lamassu statues, winged bulls with human faces, and intricately carved reliefs of kings in battle or hunting lions. These artifacts conveyed a sense of both awe and unease, testifying to the power and cruelty of the Assyrian kings, while also revealing their sophistication as artists and engineers. Biblical scholars were astonished to see confirmation of places and names long thought to be purely textual, while historians grappled with the realization that Assyria had been one of the great civilizations of antiquity, rivaling Egypt in scale and achievement. Ashurbanipal's library in particular revolutionized our understanding of Mesopotamian culture. The discovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh among its tablets opened an entirely new chapter in world literature, revealing themes of heroism, mortality, and the search for meaning that resonated across time. Other texts illuminated the sciences, rituals, and myths of Mesopotamia, providing an unparalleled glimpse into the intellectual world of the ancient Near East. Thus, the very library that Ashurbanipal had gathered to glorify his reign became, in rediscovery, one of the most important legacies of Assyria to humanity. The modern construction of Assyria's legacy has been complex, shaped by both scholarly study and political identity. For the descendants of the ancient Assyrians, the rediscovery of their history provided a renewed sense of cultural pride. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Assyrian communities around the world, particularly in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and the diaspora, have embraced their ancient heritage as a cornerstone of modern identity. Festivals, literature, and organizations have celebrated Assyrian continuity, linking the ancient empire to the modern Assyrian people and their struggles for recognition. At the same time, Assyria's ruins have remained contested symbols in the politics of the Middle East. The sites of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad, located primarily in northern Iraq, have faced threats from conflict, neglect, and deliberate destruction. In recent years, acts of cultural vandalism by extremist groups have targeted Assyrian monuments, seeking to erase the physical traces of pre-Islamic history. Yet these very attacks have underscored the enduring importance of Assyria's legacy, sparking international efforts to preserve and protect its remains. In academic circles, the study of Assyria has continued to expand, with archaeologists and historians uncovering new evidence about its society, economy, and culture. Far from being remembered only as a brutal empire of conquest, modern scholarship has highlighted the complexity of Assyrian civilization, their administrative innovations, artistic achievements, and contributions to the preservation of Mesopotamian heritage. This more nuanced view balances the terror of their warfare with the brilliance of their statecraft, offering a fuller picture of what Assyria represented. Assyria's legacy also extends into the broader narrative of world history. The concept of the empire itself, the idea that vast, diverse territories could be unified under a single centralized authority, was refined by the Assyrians and passed down through Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Their techniques of governance, communication, and military organization became models for later powers, shaping the trajectory of political development across centuries. In this sense, every empire that followed bore, whether consciously or not, the imprint of Assyrian precedent. For the modern Assyrian people, the challenge has been to assert their identity within a world that has often overlooked or marginalized them. Scattered across the Middle East and global diaspora, they have drawn upon their ancient history as a source of resilience and unity. Churches, cultural organizations, and academic institutions have worked to preserve Assyrian language, traditions, and memory, ensuring that the name of Assyria endures not only in history books, but in living communities. In this way, the legacy of Assyria is not confined to ruins and artifacts, but is embodied in people who continue to claim descent from one of the world's earliest empires. The story of Assyria's legacy is thus one of transformation. From the ashes of Nineveh, its memory survived in hostile accounts and forgotten mounds. From the rediscovery of its ruins, it re-emerged as a civilization of profound significance, shaping both scholarly understanding and cultural identity. Today its influence persists not only in the lessons of history, but in the ongoing lives of those who see themselves as its heirs. Assyria was once an empire of iron and conquest, feared and hated, but it has also become a symbol of endurance, knowledge, and cultural continuity. And so the Assyrian story, which began with small cities on the Tigris and grew into an empire that dominated the Near East, does not end with its fall. It continues through its imprint on later empires, through the survival of its people, and through the rediscovery of its treasures. From forgotten ruins to modern identity, Assyria's legacy remains alive, reminding us that even the greatest powers of the past, though they may collapse, can still shape the future in ways their kings could never have foreseen.